Chapter 1, Part 1 of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard by Baroness Orczy. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The 9 Mystery, Part 1. Well, you know, some say she is the daughter of a duke, others that she was born in the gutter, and that the handle has been soldered onto her name in order to give her style and influence. I could say a lot, of course, but my lips are sealed, as the poets say. All through her successful career at the Yard, she honored me with her friendship and confidence. But when she took me in partnership, as it were, she made me promise that I would never breathe a word of her private life, and this I swore on my Bible oath, wish I may die, and all the rest of it. Yes, we always called her my lady, from the moment that she was put at the head of our section, and the chief called her Lady Molly in our presence. We of the female department are dreadfully snubbed by the men, though don't tell me that women have not 10 times as much intuition as the blundering and sterner sex. My firm belief is that we shouldn't have half so much undetected crimes if some of the so-called mysteries were put to the test of feminine investigation. Do you suppose for a moment, for instance, that the truth about that extraordinary case at 9 would ever have come to light if the men alone had had the handling of it? Would any man have taken so bold a risk as Lady Molly did when— but I am anticipating. Let me go back to that memorable morning when she came into my room in a wild state of agitation. "The chief says I may go down to 9 if I like, Mary," she said in a voice all a-quiver with excitement. "You!" I ejaculated. "What for?" "What for? What for?" she repeated eagerly. "Mary, don't you understand? It is the chance I have been waiting for. The chance of a lifetime? They are all desperate about the case up at the Yard. The public is furious, and columns of sarcastic letters appear in the daily press. None of our men know what to do. They are at their wits' end. And so this morning I went to the chief—" "Yes?" I queried eagerly, for she had suddenly ceased speaking. "Well, never mind now how I did it. I will tell you all about it on the way, for we have just got time to catch the 11 a.m. down to Canterbury. The chief says I may go, and that I may take whom I like with me. He suggested one of the men, but somehow I feel that this is woman's work, and I'd rather have you, Mary, than anyone. We will go over the preliminaries of the case together in the train, as I don't suppose that you have gotten them at your fingers' ends yet, and you have only just got time to put a few things together and meet me at Charing Cross booking office in time for that 11 a.m. sharp." She was off before I could ask her any more questions, and anyhow I was too flabbergasted to say much. A murder case in the hands of the female department? Such a thing had been unheard of until now, but I was all excitement too, and you may be sure I was at the station in good time. Fortunately, Lady Molly and I had a carriage to ourselves. It was a non-stop run to Canterbury, so we had plenty of time before us, and I was longing to know all about this case, you bet, since I was to have the honour of helping Lady Molly in it. The murder of Mary Nicholls had actually been committed at Ash Court, a fine old mansion which stands in the village of 9. The court is surrounded by magnificently timbered grounds, the most fascinating portion of which is an island in the midst of a small pond, which is spanned by a tiny rustic bridge. The island is called the Wilderness, and it is at the furthermost end of the grounds, out of sight and earshot of the mansion itself. It was in this charming spot, on the edge of the pond, that the body of a girl was found on the 5th of February last. I will spare you the horrible details of this gruesome discovery. Suffice it to say for the present that the unfortunate woman was lying on her face, with the lower portion of her body on the small grass-covered embankment, and her head, arms, and shoulders sunk in the slime of the stagnant water just below. It was Timothy Coleman, one of the under-gardeners at Ash Court, who first made this appalling discovery. He had crossed the rustic bridge and traversed the little island in its entirety when he noticed something blue lying half in and half out of the water beyond. Timothy is a stolid, unemotional kind of yokel, and once having ascertained that the object was a woman's body in a blue dress with white facings, he quietly stooped and tried to lift it out of the mud. But here even his stolidity gave way at the terrible sight which was revealed before him. That the woman, whoever she might be, had been brutally murdered was obvious, her dress in front being stained with blood. But what was so awful that it even turned old Timothy sick with horror was that, owing to the head, arms, and shoulders having apparently been in the slime for some time, they were in an advanced state of decomposition. Well, whatever was necessary was immediately done, of course. Coleman went to get assistance from the lodge, and soon the police were on the scene and had removed the unfortunate victim's remains to the small local police station. Ninescore is a sleepy, out-of-the-way village, situated some 7 miles from Canterbury and 4 from Sandwich. Soon everyone in the place had heard that a terrible murder had been committed in the village, and all the details were already freely discussed at the Green Man. To begin with, everyone said that though the body itself might be practically unrecognizable, the bright blue serge dress with the white facings was unmistakable, as were the pearl and ruby ring and the red leather purse found by Inspector Measures close to the murdered woman's hand. Within 2 hours of Timothy Coleman's gruesome find, the identity of the unfortunate victim was firmly established as that of Mary Nichols, who lived with her sister Susan at 2 Elm Cottages, in Ninescore Lane, almost opposite Ash Court. It was also known that when the police called at that address, they found the place locked and apparently uninhabited. Mrs. Hooker, who lived at No. 1 next door, explained to Inspector Measures that Susan and Mary Nichols had left home about a fortnight ago, and that she had not seen them since. "It'll be a fortnight tomorrow," she said. "I was just inside my own front door a-calling to the cat to come in. It was past 7 o'clock, and as dark a night as you ever did see. You could hardly see your hand before your eyes, and there was a nasty damp drizzle coming from everywhere. Susan and Mary came out of their cottage. I couldn't rightly see Susan, but I heard Mary's voice quite distinct. She says, 'We'll have to hurry,' she says. I, thinking they might be going to do some shopping in the village, calls out to them that I just heard the church clock strike 7, and that being Thursday and early closing, they'd find all the shops shut at Ninescore. But they took no notice and walked off towards the village, and that's the last I ever seed of them two." Further questioning among the village folk brought forth many curious details. It seems that Mary Nichols was a very flighty young woman, about whom there had already been quite a good deal of scandal, whilst Susan, on the other hand, who was very sober and steady in her conduct, had chafed considerably under her younger sister's questionable reputation, and, according to Mrs. Hooker, many were the bitter quarrels which occurred between the two girls. These quarrels, it seems, had been especially violent within the last year, whenever Mr. Lionel Lydgate called at the cottage. He was a London gentleman, it appears, a young man about town, it afterwards transpired, but he frequently stayed at Canterbury, where he had some friends, and on those occasions he would come over to Ninescore in his smart dog-cart and take Mary out for drives. Mr. Lydgate is brother to Lord Edbrooke, the multimillionaire, who was the recipient of birthday honours last year. His lordship resides at Edbrooke Castle, but he and his brother Lionel had rented Ash Court once or twice, as both were keen golfers, and Sandwich Links are very close by. Lord Edbrooke, I may add, is a married man. Mr. Lionel Lydgate, on the other hand, is just engaged to Miss Marbury, daughter of one of the canons of Canterbury. No wonder, therefore, that Susan Nichols strongly objected to her sister's name being still coupled with that of a young man far above her in station, who, moreover, was about to marry a young lady in his own rank of life. But Mary seemed not to care. She was a young woman who only liked fun and pleasure, and she shrugged her shoulders at public opinion, even though there were ugly rumours anent the parentage of a little baby girl whom she herself has placed under the care of Mrs. Williams, a widow who lived in a somewhat isolated cottage on the Canterbury Road. Mary had told Mrs. Williams that the father of the child, who was her own brother, had died very suddenly, leaving the little one on her and Susan's hands, and as they couldn't look after it properly, they wished Mrs. Williams to have charge of it. To this the latter readily agreed. The sum for the keep of the infant was decided upon, and thereafter Mary Nichols had come every week to see the little girl, and always brought the money with her. Inspector Measures called on Mrs. Williams, and certainly the worthy widow had a very startling sequel to relate to the above story. "A fortnight tomorrow," explained Mrs. Williams to the inspector, "a little after 7 o'clock. Mary Nichols come a-running into my cottage. It was an awful night, pitch dark and a nasty drizzle. Mary says to me she's in a great hurry. She's going up to London by a train from Canterbury, and wants to say good-bye to the child. She seemed terribly excited, and her clothes were very wet. I brings baby to her, and she kisses it rather wild-like, and says to me, 'You'll take good care of her, Mrs. Williams,' she says. 'I may be gone some time.' Then she puts the baby down and gives me £2, the child's keep for 8 weeks. After which, it appears, Mary once more said good-bye and ran out of the cottage, Mrs. Williams going as far as the front door with her. The night was very dark, and she couldn't see if Mary was alone or not, until presently she heard her voice saying tearfully, 'I had to kiss baby.' Then the voice died out in the distance. 'On the way to Canterbury,' Mrs. Williams said most emphatically. So far, you see, Inspector Measures was able to fix the departure of the two sisters Nichols from Ninescore on the night of January 23rd. Obviously, they left their cottage about 7, went to Mrs. Williams, where Susan remained outside, while Mary went in to say good-bye to the child. After that, all traces of them seemed to have vanished. Whether they did go to Canterbury and caught the last-up train, at what station they alighted, or when poor Mary came back, could not at present be discovered. According to the medical officer, the unfortunate girl must have been dead 12 or 13 days at the very least, as, though the stagnant water may have accelerated decomposition, the head could not have gotten to such an advanced state much under a fortnight. At Canterbury Station, neither the booking clerk nor the porters could throw any light upon the subject. Canterbury West is a busy station, and scores of passengers buy tickets and go through the barriers every day. It was impossible, therefore, to give any positive information about two young women who may or may not have travelled by the last-up train on Saturday, January 23rd, that is, a fortnight before. One thing only was certain. Whether Susan went to Canterbury and travelled by that up train or not, alone or with her sister, Mary had undoubtedly come back to Ninescore, either the same night or the following day, since Timothy Coleman found her half-decomposed remains in the grounds of Ash Court a fortnight later. Had she come back to meet her lover, or what? And where was Susan now? From the first, therefore, you see, there was a great element of mystery about the whole case, and it was only natural that the local police should feel that, unless something more definite came out at the inquest, they would like to have the assistance of some of the fellows at the Yard. So the preliminary notes were sent up to London, and some of them drifted into our hands. Lady Molly was deeply interested in it from the first, and my firm belief is that she simply worried the chief into allowing her to go down to Ninescore and see what she could do. The Ninescore Mystery, Part 2. At first it was understood that Lady Molly should only go down to Canterbury after the inquest, if the local police still felt that they were in want of assistance from London. But nothing was further from my lady's intentions than to wait until then. "I was not going to miss the first act of a romantic drama," she said to me, just as our train steamed into Canterbury Station. "Pick up your bag, Mary. We're going to tramp it to Ninescore. 2 lady artists on a sketching tour, remember, and we'll find lodgings in the village, I dare say." We had some lunch in Canterbury, and then we started to walk the 6½ miles to Ninescore, carrying our bags. We put up at one of the cottages, where the legend, "Apartments for single respectable lady or gentleman," had hospitably invited us to enter, and at 8 o'clock the next morning we found our way to the local police station, where the inquest was to take place. Such a funny little place, you know, just a cottage converted for official use, and the small room packed to its utmost holding capacity. The entire able-bodied population of the neighbourhood had, I verily believe, congregated in these 10 cubic yards of stuffy atmosphere. Inspector Measures, apprised by the chief of our arrival, had reserved 2 good places for us well in sight of witnesses, coroner and jury. The room was insupportably close, but I assure you that neither Lady Molly nor I thought much about our comfort then. We were terribly interested. From the outset the case seemed, as it were, to wrap itself more and more in its mantle of impenetrable mystery. There was precious little in the way of clues, only that awful intuition, that dark unspoken suspicion with regard to one particular man's guilt, which one could feel hovering in the minds of all those present. Neither the police nor Timothy Coleman had anything to add to what was already known. The ring and purse were produced, also the dress worn by the murdered woman. All were sworn to by several witnesses as having been the property of Mary Nichols. Timothy, on being closely questioned, said that, in his opinion, the girl's body had been pushed into the mud, as the head was absolutely embedded in it, and he didn't see how she could have fallen like that. Medical evidence was repeated. It was uncertain, as vague as before. Owing to the state of the head and neck, it was impossible to ascertain by what means the death blow had been dealt. The doctor repeated his statement that the unfortunate girl must have been dead quite a fortnight. The body was discovered on February 5th. A fortnight before that would have been on or about January 23rd. The caretaker who lived at the lodge at Ash Court could also throw but little light on the mysterious event. Neither he nor any member of his family had seen or heard anything to arouse their suspicions. Against that he explained that the wilderness, where the murder was committed, is situated some 200 yards from the lodge, with the mansion and flower garden lying between. Replying to a question put to him by a juryman, he said that the portion of the grounds is only divided off from Ninescore Lane by a low brick wall, which has a door in it, opening into the lane almost opposite Elm Cottages. He added that the mansion had been empty for over a year, and that he succeeded the last man, who died about 12 months ago. Mr. Lydgate had not been down for golf since witness had been in charge. It would be useless to recapitulate all that the various witnesses had already told the police, and were now prepared to swear to. The private life of the two sisters Nichols was gone into at full length, as much at least as was publicly known. But you know what village folk are. Except when there is a bit of scandal and gossip, they know precious little of one another's inner lives. The two girls appeared to be very comfortably off. Mary was always smartly dressed, and the baby girl whom she had placed in Mrs. Williams's charge had plenty of good and expensive clothes, whilst her keep, 5 shillings a week, was paid with unfailing regularity. What seemed certain, however, was that they did not get on well together, that Susan violently objected to Mary's association with Mr. Lydgate, and that recently she had spoken to the vicar, asking him to try to persuade her sister to go away from Ninescore altogether, so as to break entirely with the past. The Reverend Octavius Ludlow, vicar of Ninescore, seems thereupon to have had a little talk with Mary on the subject, suggesting that she should accept a good situation in London.
"But," continued the reverend gentleman, "I didn't make much impression on her. All she replied to me was that she certainly need never go into service, as she had a good income of her own, and could obtain £5,000 or more, quite easily, at any time if she chose."
"Did you mention Mr. Lydgate's name to her at all?" asked the coroner.
"Yes, I did," said the vicar after a slight hesitation.
"Well, what was her attitude then?"
"I am afraid she laughed," replied the Reverend Octavius primly, "and said very picturesquely, if somewhat ungrammatically, that some folks didn't know what they was talking about."
All very indefinite, you see. Nothing to get hold of, no motive suggested, beyond a very vague suspicion, perhaps, of blackmail, to account for a brutal crime. I must not, however, forget to tell you the 2 other facts which came to light in the course of this extraordinary inquest. Though at the time these facts seemed of wonderful moment for the elucidation of the mystery, they only helped ultimately to plunge the whole case into darkness still more impenetrable than before. I am alluding firstly to the deposition of James Franklin, a carter in the employ of one of the local farmers. He stated that about 6:30 on the same Saturday night, January 23rd, he was walking along Ninescore Lane, leading his horse and cart, as the night was indeed pitch dark. Just as he came somewhere near Elm Cottages, he heard a man's voice saying in a kind of hoarse whisper, "Open the door, can't you? It's as dark as blazes." Then a pause, after which the same voice added, "Mary, where the dickens are you?" Whereupon a girl's voice replied, "All right, I'm coming." James Franklin heard nothing more after that, nor did he see anyone in the gloom. With the stolidity peculiar to the Kentish peasantry, he thought no more of this until the day when he heard that Mary Nichols had been murdered. Then he voluntarily came forward and told his story to the police. Now, when he was closely questioned, he was quite unable to say whether these voices proceeded from that side of the lane where stand Elm Cottages, or from the other side, which is edged by the low brick wall. Finally, Inspector Measures, who really showed an extraordinary sense of what was dramatic, here produced a document which he had reserved for the last. This was a piece of paper which he had found in the red leather purse already mentioned, and which at first had not been thought very important. as the writing was identified by several people as that of the deceased, and consisted merely of a series of dates and hours, scribbled in pencil on a scrap of notepaper. But suddenly these dates had assumed a weird and terrible significance. Two of them at least, December 26th and January 1st, followed by 10 a.m., were days on which Mr. Lydgate came over to Ninescore and took Mary for drives. One or two witnesses swore to this positively. Both dates had been local meets of the harriers, to which other folk from the village had gone, and Mary had openly said afterwards how much she had enjoyed these. The other dates, there were 6 altogether, were more or less vague. One Mrs. Hooker remembered as being coincident with a day Mary Nicholls had spent away from home, but the last date, scribbled in the same handwriting, was January 23rd, and below it the hour, 6 p.m. The coroner now adjourned the inquest. An explanation for Mr. Lionel Lydgate had become imperative. The Ninescore Mystery, Part 3. Public excitement had by now reached a very high pitch. It was no longer a case of mere local interest. The country inns all round the immediate neighbourhood were packed with visitors from London, artists, journalists, dramatists, and actor-managers, while the hotels and fly proprietors of Canterbury were doing a roaring trade. Certain facts and one vivid picture stood out clearly before the thoughtful mind in the midst of a chaos of conflicting and irrelevant evidence. The picture was that of the 2 women tramping in the wet and pitch-dark night towards Canterbury. Beyond that, everything was a blur. When did Mary Nicholls come back to Ninescore, and why? To keep an appointment made with Lionel Lydgate, it was openly whispered. But that appointment, if the rough notes were interpreted rightly, was for the very day on which she and her sister went away from home. A man's voice called to her at 6:30, certainly, and she replied to it. Franklin, the carter, heard her, but half an hour afterwards Mrs. Hooker heard her voice when she left home with her sister, and she visited Mrs. Williams after that. The only theory compatible with all this was, of course, that Mary merely accompanied Susan part of the way to Canterbury, then went back to meet her lover, who enticed her into the deserted grounds of Ash Court, and there murdered her. The motive was not far to seek. Mr. Lionel Lydgate, about to marry, wished to silence forever a voice that threatened to be unpleasantly persistent in its demands for money and in its threats of scandal. But there was one great argument against that theory, the disappearance of Susan Nicholls. She had been extensively advertised for. The murder of her sister was published broadcast in every newspaper in the United Kingdom. She could not be ignorant of it. And above all, she hated Mr. Lydgate. Why did she not come and add the weight of her testimony against him, if, indeed, he was guilty? And if Mr. Lydgate was innocent, then where was the criminal? And why had Susan Nicholls disappeared? Why? Well, the next day would show. Mr. Lionel Lydgate had been cited by the police to give evidence at the adjourned inquest. Good-looking, very athletic, and obviously frightfully upset and nervous, he entered the little courtroom, accompanied by his solicitor, just before the coroner and jury took their seats. He looked keenly at Lady Molly as he sat down, and from the expression on his face I guessed that he was very much puzzled to know who she was. He was the first witness called. Manfully and clearly he gave a concise account of his association with the deceased. "She was pretty and amusing," he said. "I liked to take her out when I was in the neighbourhood. It was no trouble to me. There was no harm in her, whatever the village gossips might say. I know she had been in trouble, as they say, but that had nothing to do with me. It wasn't for me to be hard on a girl, and I fancy that she has been very badly treated by some scoundrel." Here he was hard pressed by the coroner, who wished him to explain what he meant. But Mr. Lydgate turned obstinate, and to every leading question he replied stolidly and very emphatically, "I don't know who it was. It had nothing to do with me, but I was sorry for the girl because of everyone turning against her, including her sister, and I tried to give her a little pleasure when I could." That was all right, very sympathetically told. The public quite liked this pleasing specimen of English cricket, golf, and football-loving manhood. Subsequently, Mr. Lydgate admitted meeting Mary on December 26th and January 1st, but he swore most emphatically that that was the last he ever saw of her. "But the 23rd of January," here insinuated the coroner. "You made an appointment with the deceased then?" "Certainly not," he replied. "But you met her on that day?" "Most emphatically no," he replied quietly.
I went down to Edbrook Castle, my brother's place in Lincolnshire, on the 20th of last month, and only got back to town about 3 days ago." "You swear to that, Mr. Lydgate?" asked the coroner. "I do indeed, and there are a score of witnesses to bear me out. The family, the house party, the servants." He tried to dominate his own excitement, I suppose, poor man. He had only just realized that certain horrible suspicions had been resting upon him. His solicitor pacified him, and presently he sat down, whilst I must say that everyone there present was relieved at the thought that the handsome young athlete was not a murderer after all. To look at him it certainly seemed preposterous. But then, of course, there was the deadlock, and as there were no more witnesses to be heard, no new facts to elucidate, the jury returned the usual verdict against some person or persons unknown, and we, the keenly interested spectators, were left to face the problem. Who murdered Mary Nichols, and where was her sister Susan? The 9 Mystery, Part 4. After the verdict we found our way back to our lodgings. Lady Molly tramped along silently, with that deep furrow between her brows, which I knew meant that she was deep in thought. "Now we'll have some tea," I said, with a sigh of relief, as soon as we entered the cottage door. "No, you won't," replied my lady dryly. "I am going to write out a telegram, and we'll go straight on to Canterbury and send it from there." "To Canterbury!" I gasped. 2 hours' walk at least, for I don't suppose we can get a trap, and it is past 3 o'clock. Why not send your telegram from 9 "Mary, you are stupid," was all the reply I got. She wrote out 2 telegrams, one of which was at least 3 dozen words long, and, once more calling me to come along, we set out for Canterbury. I was tealess, cross, and puzzled. Lady Molly was alert, cheerful, and irritatingly active. We reached the first telegraph office a little before 5. My lady sent the telegram without condescending to tell me anything of its destination or contents. Then she took me to the Castle Hotel and graciously offered me tea. "May I be allowed to inquire whether you propose tramping back to 9 to-night?" I asked with a slight touch of sarcasm, as I really felt put out. "No, Mary," she replied, quietly munching a bit of Sally Lunn. "I have engaged a couple of rooms at this hotel, and wired the chief that any message will find us here tomorrow morning." After that there was nothing for it but quietude, patience, and finally supper and bed. The next morning my lady walked into my room before I had finished dressing. She had a newspaper in her hand, and threw it down on the bed as she said calmly, "It was in the evening paper all right last night. I think we shall be in time." No use asking her what it meant. It was easier to pick up the paper, which I did. It was a late edition of one of the leading London evening shockers, and at once the front page, with its startling headline, attracted my attention. "The 9 Mystery. Mary Nichols' baby dying." Then below that a short paragraph. "We regret to learn that the little baby daughter of the unfortunate girl who was murdered recently at Ash Court, 9 Kent, under such terrible and mysterious circumstances, is very seriously ill at the cottage of Mrs. Williams, in whose charge she is. The local doctor who visited her today declares that she cannot last more than a few hours. At the time of going to press, the nature of the child's complaint was not known to our special representative at 9 "What does this mean?" I gasped. But before she could reply there was a knock at the door. "A telegram for Miss Granard," said the voice of the hall porter. "Quick, Mary," said Lady Molly eagerly. "I told the chief and also Measures to wire here and to you." The telegram turned out to have come from 9 and was signed Measures. Lady Molly read it aloud. "Mary Nichols arrived here this morning, detained her at station. Come at once." "Mary Nichols? I don't understand," was all I could contrive to say. But she only replied, "I knew it! I knew it! Oh, Mary, what a wonderful thing is human nature, and how I thank Heaven that gave me a knowledge of it." She made me get dressed all in a hurry, and then we swallowed some breakfast hastily whilst a fly was being got for us. I had perforce to satisfy my curiosity from my own inner consciousness. Lady Molly was too absorbed to take any notice of me. Evidently the chief knew what she had done and approved of it. The telegram from Measures pointed to that. My lady had suddenly become a personality. Dressed very quietly and in a smart, close-fitting hat, she looked years older than her age, owing also to the seriousness of her mien. The fly took us to 9 fairly quickly. At the little police station we found Measures awaiting us. He had Elliot and Pegram from the yard with him. They had obviously got their orders, for all 3 of them were mighty deferential. "The woman is Mary Nichols right enough," said Measures, as Lady Molly brushed quickly past him. "The woman who was supposed to have been murdered. It's that silly bogus paragraph about the infant brought her out of her hiding place. I wonder how it got in," he added blandly. "The child is well enough." "I wonder," said Lady Molly, whilst a smile, the first I had seen that morning, lit up her pretty face. "I suppose the other sister will turn up too presently," rejoined Elliot. "Pretty lot of trouble we shall have now. If Mary Nicholls is alive and kicking, who was murdered at Ash Court, say I?" "I wonder," said Lady Molly with the same charming smile. Then she went in to see Mary Nicholls. The Reverend Octavius Ludlow was sitting beside the girl, who seemed in great distress, for she was crying bitterly. Lady Molly asked Elliot and the others to remain in the passage while she herself went into the room, I following behind her. When the door was shut, she went up to Mary Nicholls, and assuming a hard and severe manner, she said, "Well, you have at last made up your mind, have you, Nicholls? I suppose you know that we have applied for a warrant for your arrest?" The woman gave a shriek, which unmistakably was one of fear. "My arrest!" she gasped. "What for?" "The murder of your sister Susan." "'Twasn't me," she said quickly. "Then Susan is dead?" retorted Lady Molly quietly. Mary saw that she had betrayed herself. She gave Lady Molly a look of agonized horror, then turned as white as a sheet, and would have fallen had not the Reverend Octavius Ludlow gently led her to a chair. "It wasn't me," she repeated with a heart-broken sob. "That will be for you to prove," said Lady Molly dryly. "The child cannot now, of course, remain with Mrs. Williams. She will be removed to the workhouse and—" "No, it shan't be," said the mother excitedly. "She shan't be, I tell you. The workhouse, indeed!" she cried in a paroxysm of hysterical tears. "And her father a lord!" The reverend gentleman and I gasped in astonishment. But Lady Molly had worked up to this climax so ingeniously that it was obvious she had guessed it all along, and had merely led Mary Nicholls on in order to get this admission from her. How well she had known human nature in pitting the child against the sweetheart. Mary Nicholls was ready enough to hide herself, to part from her child even for a while, in order to save the man she had once loved from the consequences of his crime. But when she heard that her child was dying, she no longer could bear to leave it among strangers. And when Lady Molly taunted her with the workhouse, she exclaimed in her maternal pride, "The workhouse, and her father a lord!" Driven into a corner, she confessed the whole truth. Lord Edbrooke, then Mr. Lydgate, was the father of her child. Knowing this, her sister Susan had, for over a year now, systematically blackmailed the unfortunate man, not altogether, it seems, without Mary's connivance. In January last she got him to come down to Ninescore under the distinct promise that Mary would meet him and hand over to him the letters she had received from him, as well as the ring he had given her, in exchange for the sum of £5,000. The meeting place was arranged, but at the last moment Mary was afraid to go in the dark. Susan, nothing daunted, but anxious about her own reputation, in case she should be seen talking to a man so late at night, put on Mary's dress, took the ring and the letters, also her sister's purse, and went to meet Lord Edbrooke. What happened at that interview no one will ever know. It ended with the murder of the blackmailer. I suppose the fact that Susan had, in measure, begun by impersonating her sister, gave the murderer the first thought of confusing the identity of his victim by the horrible device of burying the body in the slimy mud. Anyway, he almost did succeed in hoodwinking the police, and would have done so entirely but for Lady Molly's strange intuition in the matter. After his crime he ran instinctively to Mary's cottage. He had to make a clean breast of it to her, as, without her help, he was a doomed man. So he persuaded her to go away from home, and to leave no clue or trace of herself or her sister in Ninescore. With the help of money which he would give her, she could begin life anew somewhere else, and no doubt he deluded the unfortunate girl with promises that her child would be restored to her very soon. Thus he enticed Mary Nicholls away, who would have been the great and all-important witness against him the moment his crime was discovered. A girl of Mary's type and class instinctively obeys the man she has once loved, the man who is the father of her child. She consented to disappear and to allow all the world to believe that she had been murdered by some unknown miscreant. Then the murderer quietly returned to his luxurious home at Edbrooke Castle, unsuspected. No one had thought of mentioning his name in connection with that of Mary Nicholls. In the days when he used to come down to Ash Court he was Mr. Lydgate, and when he became a peer, sleepy, out-of-the-way Ninescore ceased to think of him. Perhaps Mr. Lionel Lydgate knew all about his brother's association with the village girl. From his attitude at the inquest, I should say he did.
but of course he would not betray his own brother unless forced to do so. Now, of course, the whole aspect of the case was changed. The veil of mystery had been torn asunder owing to the insight, the marvelous intuition of a woman who, in my opinion, is the most wonderful psychologist of her time. You know the sequel. Our fellows at the Yard, aided by the local police, took their lead from Lady Molly and began their investigations of Lord Edbrooke's movements on or about the 23rd of January. Even their preliminary inquiries revealed the fact that his lordship had left Edbrooke Castle on the 21st. He went up to town, saying to his wife and household that he was called away on business, and not even taking his valet with him. He put up at the Langham Hotel. But here police investigations came to an abrupt ending. Lord Edbrooke evidently got wind of them. Anyway, the day after Lady Molly so cleverly enticed Mary Nicholls out of her hiding-place and surprised her into an admission of the truth, the unfortunate man threw himself in front of the express train at Grantham railway station and was instantly killed. Human justice cannot reach him now. But don't tell me that a man would have thought of that bogus paragraph, or of the taunt which stung the motherly pride of the village girl to the quick, and thus wrung from her an admission which no amount of male ingenuity would ever have obtained. Chapter 2, Part 1 of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard by Baroness Orczy. The Frewin Miniatures. Part 1. Although, mind you, Lady Molly's methods in connection with the Ninescore mystery were not altogether approved of at the Yard, nevertheless her shrewdness and ingenuity in the matter were so undoubted that they earned for her a reputation, then and there, which placed her in the foremost rank of the force, and presently, when everyone, public and police alike, were set by the ears over the Frewin miniatures, and a reward of 1,000 guineas was offered for information that would lead to the apprehension of the thief, the chief, of his own accord and without any hesitation, offered the job to her. I don't know much about so-called works of art myself, but you can't be in the detective force, female or otherwise, without knowing something of the value of most things, and I don't think that Mr. Frewin put an excessive value on his Englehearts when he stated that they were worth £10,000. There were 8 of them, all on ivory, about 3 to 4 inches high, and they were said to be the most perfect specimens of their kind. Mr. Frewin himself had had an offer for them, less than 2 years ago, of 200,000 francs from the trustees of the Louvre, which offer, mind you, he had refused. I dare say you know that he was an immensely wealthy man, a great collector himself, as well as dealer, and that several of the most unique and most highly priced works of art found their way into his private collection. Among them, of course, the Englehart miniatures were the most noteworthy. For some time before his death Mr. Frewin had been a great invalid, and for over 2 years he had not been able to go beyond the boundary of his charming property, Blatchley House, near Brighton. There is a sad story in connection with the serious illness of Mr. Frewin, an illness which, if you remember, has since resulted in the poor old gentleman's death. He had an only son, a young man on whom the old art dealer had lavished all the education, and subsequently all the social advantages which money could give. The boy was exceptionally good-looking, and had inherited from his mother a great charm of manner which made him very popular. The Honourable Mrs. Frewin is the daughter of an English peer, more endowed with physical attributes than with worldly goods. Besides that, she is an exceptionally beautiful woman, has a glorious voice, is a fine violinist, and is no mean water-colour artist, having more than once exhibited at the Royal Academy. Unfortunately, at one time, young Frewin had got into very bad company, made many debts, some of which were quite unavowable, and there were rumours current at the time to the effect that had the police got wind of certain transactions in connection with a brother officer's cheque, a very unpleasant prosecution would have followed. Be that as it may, young Lionel Frewin had to quit his regiment, and presently he went off to Canada, where he is supposed to have gone in for farming. According to the story related by some of the servants at Blatchley House, there were violent scenes between father and son before the former consented to pay some of the young spendthrift's most pressing debts, and then find the further sum of money which was to enable young Frewin to commence a new life in the colonies. Mrs. Frewin, of course, took the matter very much to heart. She was a dainty, refined, artistic creature, who idolized her only son, but she had evidently no influence whatever over her husband, who, in common with certain English families of Jewish extraction, had an extraordinary hardness of character where the integrity of his own business fame was concerned. He absolutely never forgave his son what he considered a slur cast upon his name by the young spendthrift. He packed him off to Canada, and openly told him that he was to expect nothing further from him. All the Frewin money and the priceless art collection would be left by will to a nephew, James Hyam, whose honour and general conduct had always been beyond reproach. That Mr. Frewin really took his hereto idolized son's defalcations very much to heart was shown by the fact that the poor old man's health completely broke down after that. He had an apoplectic fit, and although he somewhat recovered, he always remained an invalid. His eyesight and brain power were distinctly enfeebled, and about 9 months ago he had a renewed seizure, which resulted in paralysis first, and subsequently in his death. The greatest, if not the only joy the poor old man had during the 2 years which he spent pinned to an invalid chair was his art collection. Blatchley House was a perfect art museum, and the invalid would have his chair wheeled up and down the great hall and along the rooms where his pictures and china, and above all, where his priceless miniatures were stored. He took an enormous pride in these, and it was, I think, with a view to brightening him up a little that Mrs. Frewin invited Monsieur de Colinville, who had always been a great friend of her husband, to come and stay at Blatchley. Of course, there is no greater connoisseur of art anywhere than that distinguished Frenchman, and it was through him that the celebrated offer of £8,000 was made by the Louvre for the Englehart miniatures. Though of course the invalid declined the offer, he took a great pleasure and pride in the fact that it had been made, as, in addition to Monsieur de Colinville himself, several members of the Committee of Art Advisers to the Louvre came over from Paris in order to try and persuade Mr. Frewin to sell his unique treasures. However, the invalid was obdurate about that. He was not in want of money, and the celebrated Frewin art collection would go intact to his widow for her life, and then to his heir, Mr. James Hyam, a great connoisseur himself, an art dealer of St. Petersburg and London. It was really a merciful dispensation of Providence that the old man never knew of the disappearance of his valued miniatures. By the time that extraordinary mystery had come to light, he was dead. On the evening of January 14th, at 8:30, Mr. Frewin had a third paralytic seizure, from which he never recovered. His valet, Kennett, and his 2 nurses were with him at the time, and Mrs. Frewin, quickly apprised of the terrible event, flew to his bedside, whilst the motor was at once dispatched for the doctor. About an hour or 2 later, the dying man seemed to rally somewhat, but he appeared very restless and agitated, and his eyes were roaming anxiously about the room. "I expect it is his precious miniatures he wants," said Nurse Dawson. "He is always quiet when he can play with them." She reached for the large leather case which contained the priceless art treasures, and, opening it, placed it on the bed beside the patient. Mr. Frewin, however, was obviously too near death to care even for his favourite toy. He fingered the miniatures with trembling hands for a few moments, and then sank back exhausted on the pillows. "He is dying," said the doctor quietly, turning to Mrs. Frewin. "I have something to say to him," she then said. "Can I remain alone with him for a few minutes?" "Certainly," said the doctor, as he himself discreetly retired. "But I think one of the nurses had better remain within earshot." Nurse Dawson, it appeared, remained within earshot to some purpose, for she overheard what Mrs. Frewin was saying to her dying husband. "It is about Lionel, your only son," she said. "Can you understand what I say?" The sick man nodded. "You remember that he is in Brighton, staying with Alicia. I can go and fetch him in the motor if you will consent to see him." Again the dying man nodded. I suppose Mrs. Frewin took this to mean acquiescence, for the next moment she rang for John Chipps, the butler, and gave him instructions to order her motor at once. She then kissed the patient on the forehead and prepared to leave the room, but just before she did so, her eyes lighted on the case of miniatures, and she said to Kennett, the valet, "Give these to Chipps, and tell him to put them in the library." She then went to put on her furs preparatory to going out. When she was quite ready, she met Chipps on the landing, who had just come up to tell her that the motor was at the door. He had in his hand the case of miniatures which Kennett had given him. "Put the case on the library table, Chips, when you go down," she said.
"Yes, madam," he replied.
He followed her downstairs, then slipped into the library, put the case on the table as he had been directed, after which he saw his mistress into the motor, and finally closed the front door. The Frewin Miniatures, Part II. About an hour later Mrs. Frewin came back, but without her son. It transpired afterwards that the young man was more vindictive than his father. He refused to go to the latter's bedside in order to be reconciled at the 11th hour to a man who then had no longer either his wits or his physical senses about him. However, the dying man was spared the knowledge of his son's irreconcilable conduct, for, after a long and wearisome night passed in a state of coma, he died at about 6 a.m. It was quite late the following afternoon when Mrs. Frewin suddenly recollected the case of miniatures, which should have been locked in their accustomed cabinet. She strode leisurely into the library. She was very fatigued and worn out with the long vigil and the sorrow and anxiety she had just gone through. A quarter of an hour later, John Chips found her in the same room, sitting dazed and almost fainting in an armchair. In response to the old butler's anxious query, she murmured, "The miniatures, where are they?" Scared at the abruptness of the query, and at his mistress's changed tone of voice, Chips gazed quickly around him. "You told me to put them on the table, ma'am," he murmured, "and I did so. They certainly don't seem to be in the room now," he added, with a sudden feeling of terror. "Run and ask one of the nurses at once if the case was taken up to Mr. Frewin's room during the night." Chips, needless to say, did not wait to be told twice. He was beginning to feel very anxious. He spoke to Kennett and also to the two nurses, and asked them if, by any chance, the miniatures were in the late master's room. To this Kennett and the nurses replied in the negative. The last they had seen of the miniatures was when Chips took them from the valet and followed his mistress downstairs with the case in his hands. The poor old butler was in despair, the cook was in hysterics, and consternation reigned throughout the house. The disappearance of the miniatures caused almost a greater excitement than the death of the master, who had been a dying man so long that he was almost a stranger to the servants at Blatchley. Mrs. Frewin was the first to recover her presence of mind. "Send a motor at once to the police station at Brighton," she said very calmly, as soon as she completely realized that the miniatures were nowhere to be found. "It is my duty to see that this matter is thoroughly gone into at once." Within half an hour of the discovery of the theft, Detective Inspector Hankin and Police Constable McLeod had both arrived from Brighton, having availed themselves of Mrs. Frewin's motor. They are shrewd men, both of them, and it did not take them many minutes before they had made up their minds how the robbery had taken place. By whom it was done was quite another matter, and would take some time and some ingenuity to find out. What Detective Inspector Hankin had gathered was this. While John Chips saw his mistress into the motor, the front door of the house had, of necessity, been left wide open. The motor then made a start, but after a few paces it stopped, and Mrs. Frewin put her head out of the window and shouted to Chips some instructions with regard to the nurse's evening collation, which, in view of Mr. Frewin's state, she feared might be forgotten. Chips, being an elderly man and a little deaf, did not hear her voice distinctly, so he ran up to the motor, and she repeated her instructions to him. In Inspector Hankin's mind there was no doubt that the thief, who must have been hanging about the shrubbery that evening, took that opportunity to sneak into the house, then to hide himself in a convenient spot until he could find an opportunity for the robbery which he had in view. The butler declared that, when he returned, he saw nothing unusual. He had only been gone a little over a minute. He then fastened and bolted the front door, and according to his usual custom, he put up all the shutters of the ground-floor windows, including, of course, those in the library. He had no light with him when he did this accustomed round, for, of course, he knew his way well enough in the dark, and the electric chandelier in the hall gave him what light he wanted. While he was putting up the shutters, Chips was giving no particular thought to the miniatures, but strangely enough he seems to have thought of them about an hour later, when most of the servants had gone to bed and he was waiting up for his mistress. He then, quite casually and almost absent-mindedly, when crossing the hall, turned the key of the library door, thus locking it from the outside. Of course, throughout all this we must remember that Blatchley House was not in its normal state that night, since its master was actually dying in a room on the floor above the library. The 2 nurses and Kennett the valet were all awake, and with him during the whole of that night. Kennett certainly was in and out of the room several times, having to run down and fetch various things required by the doctor or the nurses. In order to do this, he did not use the principal staircase, nor did he have to cross the hall, but as far as the upper landing and the secondary stairs were concerned, he certainly had not noticed anything unusual or suspicious, whilst when Mrs. Frewin came home, she went straight up to the first floor, and certainly noticed nothing in any way to arouse her suspicions. But, of course, this meant very little, as she certainly must have been too upset and agitated to see anything. The servants were not apprised of the death of their master until after their breakfast. In the meanwhile, Emily, the housemaid, had been in, as usual, to do the library. She distinctly noticed, when she first went in, that none of the shutters were up, and that one of the windows was open. She thought at the time that someone must have been in the room before her, and meant to ask Chipps about it, when the news of the master's death drove all thoughts of open windows from her mind. Strangely enough, when Hankin questioned her more closely about it, and she had had time to recollect everything more clearly, she made the extraordinary statement that she certainly had noticed that the door of the library was locked on the outside when she first went into the room, the key being in the lock.
"Then didn't it strike you as very funny," asked Hankin, "that the door was locked on the outside, and yet the shutters were unbarred and one of the windows was open?"
"Yes, I did seem to think of that," replied Emily, with that pleasant vagueness peculiar to her class. "But then the room did not look like burglars. It was quite tidy, just as it had been last night. And burglars always seem to leave a great mess behind, else I should have noticed," she added, with offended dignity.
"But did you not see that the miniatures were not in their usual place?"
"Oh, they often wasn't in the cabinet, as the master used to ask for them sometimes to be brought to his room." That was, of course, indisputable. It was clearly evident that the burglar had had plenty of chances to make good his escape. You see, the actual time when the miscreant must have sneaked into the room had now been narrowed down to about an hour and a half, between the time when Mrs. Frewin finally left in her motor to about an hour later, when Chipps turned the key in the door of the library, and thus undoubtedly locked the thief in. At what precise time of the night he effected his escape could not anyhow be ascertained. It must have been after Mrs. Frewin came back again, as Hankin held that she or her chauffeur would have noticed that one of the library windows was open. This opinion was not shared by Elliot from the yard, who helped in the investigation of this mysterious crime, as Mrs. Frewin was certainly very agitated and upset that evening, and her powers of perception would necessarily be blunted. As for the chauffeur, we all know that the strong headlights on a motor are so dazzling that nothing can be seen outside their blinding circle of light. Be that as it may, it remained doubtful when the thief made good his escape. It was easy enough to effect, and as there is a square of flagstones in front of the main door, and just below the library windows, the thief left not the slightest trace of footprints, whilst the drop from the window is less than 8 feet. What was strange in the whole case, and struck Detective Hankin immediately, was the fact that the burglar, whoever he was, must have known a great deal about the house and its ways. He also must have had a definite purpose in his mind, not usually to be found in the brain of a common housebreaker. He must have meant to steal the miniatures and nothing else, since he made his way straight to the library, and having secured the booty, at once made good his escape without trying to get any other article which could more easily be disposed of than works of art. You may imagine, therefore, how delicate a task now confronted Inspector Hankin. You see, he had questioned everyone in the house, including Mr. Frewin's valet and nurses, and from them he casually heard of Mrs. Frewin's parting words to her dying husband, and of her mention of the scapegrace's son, who was evidently in the immediate neighbourhood, and whom she wished to come and see his father. Mrs. Frewin, closely questioned by the detective, admitted that her son was staying in Brighton, and that she saw him that very evening. "Mr. Lionel Frewin is staying at the Metropole Hotel," she said coldly, "and he was dining with my sister, Lady Steyne, last night. He was in the house at Sussex Square when I arrived in my motor," she added hastily, guessing perhaps the unavowed suspicion which had arisen in Hankin's mind, "and he was still there when I left. I drove home very fast, naturally, as my husband's condition was known to me to be quite hopeless, and that he was not expected to live more than perhaps a few hours. We covered the 7 miles between this house and that of my sister in less than a quarter of an hour." This statement of Mrs. Frewin's was, if you remember, fully confirmed both by her sister and her brother-in-law, Lady Steyne and Sir Michael. There was no doubt that young Lionel Frewin was staying at the Hotel Metropole in Brighton, that he was that evening dining with the Steynes at Sussex Square, when his mother arrived in her motor. Mrs. Frewin stayed about an hour, during which time she presumably tried to influence her son to go back to Blatchley with her, in order to see his dying father. Of course, what exactly happened at that family interview none of the 4 people present was inclined to reveal. Against that, both Sir Michael and Lady Steyne were prepared to swear that Mr. Lionel Frewin was in the house when his mother arrived, and that he did not leave them until long after she had driven away. There lay the hitch, you see, for already the public jumped to conclusions, and terribly prejudiced as it is in a case of this sort, it had made up its mind that Mr. Lionel Frewin, once more pressed for money, had stolen his father's precious miniatures in order to sell them in America for a high sum. Everyone's sympathy was dead against the young son who refused to be reconciled to his father, although the latter was dying. According to one of the footmen in Lady Steyne's employ, who had taken whiskies and sodas in while the interview between Mrs. Frewin and her son was taking place, Mr. Lionel had said very testily, "It's all very well, mother, but that is sheer sentimentality. The governor threw me on my beam ends, when a little kindness and help would have meant a different future to me. He chose to break my life because of some early peccadilloes, and I am not going to fawn round him and play the hypocrite, when he has no intention of altering his will and has cut me off with a shilling. He must be half imbecile by now, and won't know me anyway." But with all this, and with public opinion so dead against him, it was quite impossible to bring the crime home to the young man. The burglar, whoever he was, must have sneaked into the library some time before Chipps closed the door on the outside, since it was still so found by Emily the following morning. Thereupon the public, determined that Lionel Frewin should in some way be implicated in the theft, made up its mind that the doting mother, hearing of her son's woeful want of money, stole the miniatures herself that night and gave them to him. The Frewin Miniatures, Part 3. When Lady Molly heard this theory, she laughed and shrugged her pretty shoulders. "Old Mr. Frewin was dying, was he not, at the time of the burglary?" she said. "Why should his wife, soon to become his widow, take the trouble to go through a laboured and daring comedy of a burglary in order to possess herself of things which would become hers within the next few hours, even if, after Mr. Frewin's death, she could not actually dispose of the miniatures? The old man left her a large sum of money and a big income by his will, with which she could help her spendthrift son as much as she pleased." This was, of course, why the mystery in this strange case was so deep. At the Yard they did all that they could. Within 48 hours they had notices printed in every European language, which contained rough sketches of the stolen miniatures hastily supplied by Mrs. Frewin herself. These were sent to as many of the great museums and art collectors abroad as possible, and of course to the principal American cities and to American millionaires. There is no doubt that the thief would find it very difficult to dispose of the miniatures, and until he could sell them his booty would, of course, not benefit him in any way. Works of art cannot be tampered with, or melted down or taken to pieces, like silver or jewellery, and so far as could be ascertained, the thief did not appear to make the slightest attempt to dispose of the booty, and the mystery became more dark, more impenetrable than ever. "Will you undertake the job?" said the chief one day to Lady Molly. "Yes," she replied, "on 2 distinct conditions." "What are they?" "That you will not bother me with useless questions, and that you will send out fresh notices to all the museums and art collectors you can think of, and request them to let you know of any art purchases they have made within the last 2 years." "The last 2 years!" ejaculated the chief. "Why, the miniatures were only stolen 3 months ago." "Did I not say that you were not to ask me useless questions?" This to the chief, mind you, and he only smiled, whilst I nearly fell backwards at her daring. But he did send out the notices, and it was generally understood that Lady Molly now had charge of the case. Part 4. It was about 7 weeks later when, one morning, I found her at breakfast, looking wonderfully bright and excited. "The Yard has had sheaves of replies, Mary," she said gaily, "and the chief still thinks I am a complete fool." "Why, what has happened?" Only this, that the Art Museum at Budapest has now in its possession a set of 8 miniatures by Engelhardt, but the authorities did not think that the first notices from Scotland Yard could possibly refer to these, as they had been purchased from a private source a little over 2 years ago. But 2 years ago the Frewin miniatures were still at Blatchley House, and Mr. Frewin was fingering them daily, I said, not understanding, and wondering what she was driving at. I know that, she said gaily. So does the chief. That is why he thinks that I am a first-class idiot. But what do you wish to do now? Go to Brighton, Mary. Take you with me, and try to elucidate the mystery of the Frewin miniatures. I don't understand, I gasped, bewildered. No, and you won't until we get there, she replied, running up to me and kissing me in her pretty, engaging way. That same afternoon we went to Brighton and took up our abode at the Hotel Metropole. Now you know I always believed from the very first that she was a born lady, and all the rest of it, but even I was taken aback at the number of acquaintances and smart friends she had all over the place. It was, "Hello, Lady Molly, whoever would have thought of meeting you here?" and, "Upon my word, this is good luck," all the time. She smiled and chatted gaily with all the folk as if she had known them all her life, but I could easily see that none of these people knew that she had anything to do with the Yard. Brighton is not such a very big place as one would suppose, and most of the fashionable residents of the gay city find their way sooner or later to the luxurious dining-room of the Hotel Metropole, if only for a quiet little dinner given when the cook is out. Therefore I was not a little surprised when, one evening, about a week after our arrival, and just as we were sitting down to the table d'hôte dinner, Lady Molly suddenly placed one of her delicate hands on my arm. "Look behind you, a little to your left, Mary, but not just this minute. When you do, you will see 2 ladies and 2 gentlemen sitting at a small table quite close to us. They are Sir Michael and Lady Steyne, the Honourable Mrs. Frewin in deep black, and her son, Mr. Lionel Frewin." I looked round as soon as I could, and gazed with some interest at the hero and heroine of the Blatchley House drama. We had a quiet little dinner, and Lady Molly having all of a sudden become very silent and self-possessed, altogether different from her gay, excited self of the past few days, I scented that something important was in the air, and tried to look as unconcerned as my lady herself. After dinner we ordered coffee, and as Lady Molly strolled into the lounge, I noticed that she ordered our tray to be placed at a table which was in very close proximity to the one already occupied by Lady Steyne and her party. Lady Steyne, I noticed, gave Lady Molly a pleasant nod when we first came in, and Sir Michael got up and bowed, saying, "How do you do?" We sat down and began a desultory conversation together. Soon, as usual, we were joined by various friends and acquaintances, who all gathered around our table and set themselves to entertaining us right pleasantly. Presently the conversation drifted to art matter, Sir Anthony Truscott being there, who is, as you know, one of the keepers of the art department at South Kensington Museum. "I'm crazy about miniatures just now," said Lady Molly in response to a remark from Sir Anthony. I tried not to look astonished. "And Miss Granard and I," continued my lady quite unblushingly, "have been travelling all over the Continent in order to try and secure some rare specimens." "Indeed," said Sir Anthony. "Have you found anything very wonderful?" "We certainly have discovered some rare works of art," replied Lady Molly. "Have we not, Mary? Now the 2 Engleharts we bought at Budapest are undoubtedly quite unique." "Engelhardt? And at Budapest?" remarked Sir Anthony. "I thought I knew the collections at most of the great continental cities, but I certainly have no recollection of such treasures in the Hungarian capital." "Oh, but they were only purchased 2 years ago, and have only been shown to the public recently," remarked Lady Molly. "There was originally a set of 8. So the controller, Mr. Polsky, informed me. He bought them from an English collector, whose name I have now forgotten, and he is very proud of them, but they cost the country a great deal more money than it could afford, and in order somewhat to recoup himself, Mr. Polsky sold 2 out of the 8, at, I must say, a very stiff price." While she was talking I could not help noticing the strange glitter in her eyes. Then a curious smothered sound broke upon my ear. I turned and saw Mrs. Frewin looking with glowing and dilated eyes at the charming picture presented by Lady Molly. "I should like to show you my purchases," said the latter to Sir Anthony. "1 or 2 foreign connoisseurs have seen the 2 miniatures, and declare them to be the finest in existence. Mary," she added, turning to me, Would you be so kind as to run up to my room and get me the small sealed packet which is at the bottom of my dressing-case? Here are the keys." A little bewildered, yet guessing by her manner that I had a part to play, I took the keys from her and went up to her room. In her dressing-case I certainly found a small, square, flat packet, and with that in my hand I prepared to go downstairs again. I had just locked the bedroom door when I was suddenly confronted by a tall, graceful woman dressed in deep black, whom I at once recognized as the Honourable Mrs. Frewin. "You are Miss Granard?" she said quickly and excitedly. Her voice was tremulous, and she seemed a prey to the greatest possible excitement. Without waiting for my reply, she continued eagerly, "Miss Granard, there is no time to be more explicit, but I give you my word, the word of a very wretched, heart-broken woman, that my very life depends upon my catching a glimpse of the contents of the parcel that you now have in your hand." "But—" I murmured, hopelessly bewildered. "There is no but," she replied. "It is a matter of life and death. Here are £200, Miss Granard, if you will let me handle that packet." And with trembling hands she drew a bundle of banknotes from her reticule. I hesitated, not because I had any notion of acceding to Mrs. Frewin's request, but because I did not quite know how I ought to act at this strange juncture, when a pleasant, mellow voice broke in suddenly. "You may take the money, Mary, if you wish. You have my permission to hand the packet over to this lady," and Lady Molly, charming, graceful, and elegant in her beautiful directoire gown, stood smiling some few feet away, with Hankin just visible in the gloom of the corridor. She advanced towards us, took the small packet from my hand, and held it out towards Mrs. Frewin. "Will you open it?" she said, "or shall I?" Mrs. Frewin did not move. She stood as if turned to stone. Then, with dexterous fingers, my lady broke the seals of the packet and drew from it a few sheets of plain white cardboard and a thin piece of matching boarding. "There," said Lady Molly, fingering the bits of cardboard while she kept her fine, large eyes fixed on Mrs. Frewin. £200 is a big price to pay for a sight of these worthless things." "Then this was a vulgar trick," said Mrs. Frewin, drawing herself up with an air which did not affect Lady Molly in the least. "A trick, certainly," she replied with her winning smile. "Vulgar, if you will call it so. Pleasant to us all, Mrs. Frewin, since you so readily fell into it." "Well, and what are you going to do next?" "Report the matter to my chief," said Lady Molly quietly. "We have all been very severely blamed for not discovering sooner the truth about the disappearance of the Frewin miniatures." "You don't know the truth now," retorted Mrs. Frewin. "Oh, yes, I do," replied Lady Molly, still smiling. "I know that 2 years ago your son, Lionel Frewin, was in terrible monetary difficulties. There was something unavowable which he dared not tell his father. You had to set to work to find money somehow. You had no capital at your own disposal, and you wished to save your son from the terrible consequences of his own folly. It was soon after Monsieur de Colinville's visit. Your husband had had his first apoplectic seizure. His mind and eyesight were somewhat impaired. You are a very clever artist yourself, and you schemed out a plan whereby you carefully copied the priceless miniatures, and then entrusted them to your son for sale to the Art Museum at Budapest, where there was but little likelihood of their being seen by anyone who knew they had belonged to your husband. English people do not stay more than one night there, at the Hotel Hungaria. Your copies were works of art in themselves, and you had no difficulty in deceiving your husband in the state of mind he then was. But when he lay dying you realized that his will would inevitably be proved, wherein he bequeathed the miniatures to Mr. James Hyam, and that these would have to be valued for probate. Frightened now that the substitution would be discovered, you devised the clever comedy of the burglary at Blatchley, which, in the circumstances, could never be brought home to you or your son. I don't know where you subsequently concealed the spurious Engelhart miniatures, which you calmly took out of the library and hid away during the night of your husband's death, but no doubt our men will find that out, she added quietly, now that they are on the track. With a frightened shriek, Mrs. Frewin turned as if she would fly, but Lady Molly was too quick for her and barred the way. Then, with that wonderful charm of manner and that innate kindliness which always characterized her, she took hold of the unfortunate woman's wrist. "Let me give you a word of advice," she said gently. "We at the Yard will be quite content with a confession from you, which will clear us of negligence and satisfy us that the crime has been brought home to its perpetrator. After that, try and enter into an arrangement with your husband's legatee, Mr. James Hyam. Make a clean breast of the whole thing to him, and offer him full monetary compensation. For the sake of the family, he won't refuse. He would have nothing to gain by bruiting the whole thing abroad, and for his own sake and that of his late uncle, who was so good to him, I don't think you would find him hard to deal with." Mrs. Frewin paused a while, undecided and still defiant. Then her attitude softened. She turned and looked full at the beautiful, kind eyes turned eagerly up to hers, and pressing Lady Molly's tiny hand in both her own, she whispered, "I will take your advice. God bless you." She was gone, and Lady Molly called Hankin to her side. "Until we have that confession, Hankin," she said, with the quiet manner she always adopted where matters connected with her work were concerned, "mum's the word." "Aye, and after that too, my lady," replied Hankin earnestly. You see, she could do anything she liked with the men, and I, of course, was her slave. Now we have the confession, Mrs. Frewin is on the best of terms with Mr. James Hyam, who has behaved very well about the whole thing, and the public has forgotten all about the mystery of the Frewin miniatures. End of the Frewin miniatures. Chapter 3, Part 1 of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, by Baroness Orczy. The Irish Tweed Coat. Part 1. It all began with the murder of Mr. Andrew Carrthwaite at Palermo. He had been found dead in the garden of his villa just outside the town, with a stiletto between his shoulder blades, and a piece of rough Irish tweed, obviously torn from his assailant's coat, clutched tightly in his hand. All that was known of Mr. Carrthwaite over here was that he was a Yorkshireman, owner of some marble works in Sicily, a man who employed a great many hands, and that, unlike most employers of labour over there, he had a perfect horror of the many secret societies and socialist clubs which abound in that part of the world. He would not become a slave to the ever-growing tyranny of the Mafia and its kindred associations, and therefore he made it a hard and fast rule that no workman employed by him, from the foremost to the meanest hand, should belong to any society, club, or trade union of any sort or kind. At first, robbery was thought to have been the sole object of the crime, for Mr. Carrthwaite's gold watch, marked with his initials, A.C., and his chain were missing. But the Sicilian police were soon inclined to the belief that this was merely a blind, and that personal spite and revenge were at the bottom of that dastardly outrage. One clue, remember, had remained in the possession of the authorities. This was the piece of rough Irish tweed found in the murdered man's hand. Within 24 hours a dozen witnesses were prepared to swear that the fragment of cloth was part of a coat habitually worn by Mr. Carrthwaite's English overseer, Mr. Cecil Shuttleworth. It appears that this young man had lately, in defiance of the rigid rules prescribed by his employer, joined a local society, semi-social, semi-religious, which came under the ban of the old Yorkshireman's prejudices. Apparently there had been several bitter quarrels between Mr. Carrthwaite and young Shuttleworth, culminating in one tempestuous scene, witnessed by the former servants at his villa, and although these people did not understand the actual words that passed between the two Englishmen, it was pretty clear that they amounted to an ultimatum on the one side and defiance on the other. The dismissal of the overseer followed immediately, and that same evening Mr. Carrthwaite was found murdered in his garden. Mind you, according to English ideas, the preliminary investigations in that mysterious crime were hurried through in a manner which we should think unfair to the accused. It seemed from the first as if the Sicilian police had wilfully made up their minds that Shuttleworth was guilty. For instance, although so many people were prepared to swear that the young English overseer had often worn a coat of which the piece found in the murdered man's hand was undoubtedly a torn fragment, yet the coat itself was not found among his effects, and neither were his late master's watch and chain. Nevertheless, the young man was arrested within a few hours of the murder, and, after the formalities of the preliminary instruction, was duly committed to stand his trial on the capital charge. It was about this time that I severed my official connection with the Yard. Lady Molly now employed me as her private secretary, and I was working with her one day in the study of our snug little flat in Maida Vale when our trim servant came in to us with a card and a letter on a salver. Lady Molly glanced at the card, then handed it across to me. It bore the name Mr. Jeremiah Shuttleworth. The letter was from the chief. "Not much in it," she commented, glancing rapidly at its contents. "The chief only says, 'This is the father of the man who is charged with the Palermo murder. As obstinate as a mule. But you have my permission to do what he wants. Emily, show the gentleman in," she added. The next moment a short, thick-set man entered our little study. He had sandy hair and a freckled skin. There was a great look of determination in the square face, and a fund of dogged obstinacy in the broad, somewhat heavy jaw. In response to Lady Molly's invitation, he sat down, and began with extraordinary abruptness. "I suppose you know what I've come about, miss?" he suggested. "Well," she replied, holding up his own card, "I can guess." "My son, ma'am," he said in a husky voice. "He is innocent. I swear by the living—" He checked himself, obviously ashamed of this outburst. Then he resumed more calmly. "Of course, there's the business about the coat, and that coat did belong to my son, but—" "Well, yes?" asked Lady Molly, for he had paused again, as if waiting to be encouraged in his narrative. "What about that coat?" "It has been found in London, miss," he replied quietly. "The fiendish brutes who committed the crime thought out this monstrous way of diverting attention from themselves by getting hold of my son's coat and making the actual assassin wear it, in case he was espied in the gloom." There was silence in the little study for a while. I was amazed, aghast at the suggestion put forward by that rough north countryman, that sorely stricken father, who spoke with curious intensity of language and of feeling. Lady Molly was the first to break the solemn silence. "What makes you think, Mr. Shuttleworth, that the assassination of Mr. Carrthwaite was the work of a gang of murderers?" she asked. "I know, Cicely," he replied simply. "My boy's mother was a native of Messina. The place is riddled with secret societies, murdering and anarcho clubs, organizations against which Mr. Carrthwaite waged deadly warfare. It was one of these, the Mafia probably, that decreed that Mr. Carrthwaite should be done away with. They could not do with such a powerful and hard-headed enemy." "You may be right, Mr. Shuttleworth, but tell me more about the coat." "Well, that'll be damning proof against the blackguards anyway. I am on the eve of a second marriage, ma'am," continued the man with seeming irrelevance. "The lady is a widder. Mrs. Tadworth is her name, but her father was an Italian named Badini, a connection of my first wife's, and that's how I came to know him and his daughter. You know Leather Lane, don't you? It might be in Italy, for Italian's the only language one hears about there. Badini owned a house in Bread Street, Leather Lane, and let lodgings to his fellow countrymen there. This business my future wife still carries on. About a week ago, 2 men arrived at the house, father and son, so they said, who wanted a cheap bedroom. All their meals, including breakfast, they would take outside, and would be out, moreover, most of the day. It seems that they had often lodged at Badini's before. The old reprobate no doubt was one of their gang, and when they understood that Mrs. Tadworth was their former friend's daughter, they were quite satisfied. They gave their name as Piatti, and told Mrs. Tadworth that they came from Turin, but I happened to hear them talking on the stairs, and I knew they were Sicilians, both of them. You might imagine that just now everything hailing from Sicily is of vital importance to me, and somehow I suspected those 2 men from the very first. Mrs. Tadworth is quite at one with me in wanting to move heaven and earth to prove the innocence of my boy. She watched those people for me as a cat would watch a mouse. The older man professed to be very fond of gardening, and presently obtained Mrs. Tadworth's permission to busy himself in the little strip of barren ground at the back of the house. This she told me last night whilst we were having supper together in her little parlour. Somehow I seemed to get an inspiration like. The Piattis had gone out together as usual for their evening meal. I got a spade and went out into the strip of garden. I worked for about an hour, and then my heart gave one big leap. My spade had met a certain curious, soft resistance. The next moment I was working away with hands and nails, and soon unearthed a coat. The coat, miss," he continued, unable now to control his excitement, "with a bit torn out of the back, and in the pocket the watch and chain belonging to the murdered man, for they bear the initials A.C. The fiendish brutes! I knew it! And now I can prove the innocence of my boy." Again there was a pause. I was too much absorbed in the palpitating narrative to attempt to breathe a word, and I knew that Lady Molly was placidly waiting until the man had somewhat recovered from his vehement outburst. "Of course you can prove your boy's innocence now," she said, smiling encouragingly into his flushed face. But what have you done with the coat?"
"Left it buried where I found it," he replied more calmly. "They must not suspect that I am on their track."
She nodded approvingly. "No doubt, then, my chief has told you that the best course to pursue now will be to place the whole matter in the hands of the English police. Our people at Scotland Yard will then immediately communicate with the Sicilian authorities, and in the meanwhile we can keep the two men in Leather Lane well under surveillance."
"Yes, he told me all that," said Mr. Shuttleworth quietly.
"Well?"
"And I told him that his communicating with the Sicilian police authorities would result in my boy's trial being summarily concluded, in his being sent to the gallows, whilst every proof of his innocence would be destroyed, or at any rate kept back until too late."
"You are mad, Mr. Shuttleworth!" she ejaculated.
"Maybe I am," he rejoined quietly. "You see, you do not know Sicily, and I do. You do not know its many clubs and bands of assassins, beside whom the so-called Russian nihilists are simple, blundering children. The Mafia, which is the parent of all such murderous organizations, has members and agents in every town, village and hamlet in Italy, in every post office and barracks, in every trade and profession, from the highest to the lowest in the land. The Sicilian police force is infested with it. So are the Italian customs. I would not trust either with what means my boy's life and more to me."
"But—"
"The police would suppress the evidence connected with the proofs which I hold. At the frontier the coat, the watch, and the chain would disappear. Of that I am as convinced as that I am a living man."
Lady Molly made no comment. She was meditating. That there was truth in what the man said, no one could deny. The few details which we had gleaned over here of the hurried investigations, the summary commitment for trial of the accused, the hasty dismissal of all evidence in his favour, proved that, at any rate, the father's anxiety was well founded. "But then, what in the world do you propose to do?" said Lady Molly after a while. "Do you want to take the proofs over yourself to your boy's advocate? Is that it?"
"No, that would be no good," he replied simply. "I am known in Sicily. I should be watched, probably murdered too, and my death would not benefit my boy."
"But what then?"
"My boy's uncle is chief officer of police at Cividale, on the Austro-Italian frontier. I know that I can rely on his devotion. Mrs. Tadworth, whose interest in my boy is almost equal to my own, and whose connection with me cannot possibly be known out there, will take the proofs of my boy's innocence to him. He will know what to do, and how to reach my son's advocate safely, which no one else could guarantee to do."
"Well," said Lady Molly, "that being so, what is it you want us to do in the matter?"
"I want a lady's help, ma'am," he replied. "Someone who is able, willing, strong, and if possible enthusiastic, to accompany Mrs. Tadworth, perhaps in the capacity of a maid, just to avert the usual suspicious glances thrown at a lady travelling alone. Also the question of foreign languages comes in. The gentleman I saw at Scotland Yard said that if you cared to go, he would give you a fortnight's leave of absence."
"Yes, I'll go," rejoined Lady Molly simply. The Irish Tweed Coat, Part 2. We sat in the study a long while after that, Mr. Shuttleworth, Lady Molly, and I, discussing the plans of the exciting journey, for I too, as you will see, was destined to play my small part in this drama, which had the life or death of an innocent man for its denouement. I don't think I need bore you with an account of our discussion. All I think that will interest you is the plan of campaign we finally decided upon. There seemed to be no doubt that Mr. Shuttleworth had succeeded so far in not arousing the suspicions of the Piattis. Therefore, that night, when they were safely out of the way, Mr. Shuttleworth would once more unearth the coat and watch and chain, and then bury a coat similar in colour and texture in the same hole in the ground. This might perhaps serve to put the miscreants off their guard, if by any chance one of them should busy himself again in the garden. After that, Mrs. Tadworth would hide about her the proofs of young Shuttleworth's innocence, and join Lady Molly at our flat at Maida Vale, where she would spend the night preparatory to the two ladies leaving London for abroad the following morning by the 9 a.m. train from Charing Cross, en route for Vienna, Budapest, and finally Cividale. But our scheme was even more comprehensive than that, and herein lay my own little share in it, of which I tell you presently. The same evening at 9:30, Mrs. Tadworth arrived at the flat with the coat, and watch and chain, which were to be placed in the hands of Colonel Grassi, the chief police officer at Cividale. I took a keen look at the lady, you may be sure of that. It was a pretty little face enough, and she herself could not have been more than 7 or 8 and 20, but to me the whole appearance and manner of the woman suggested weakness of character, rather than that devotion on which poor Mr. Shuttleworth so implicitly relied. I suppose that it was on that account that I felt unaccountably downhearted and anxious when I bade farewell to my own dear lady, a feeling in which she obviously did not share. Then I began to enact the rôle which had been assigned to me. I dressed up in Mrs. Tadworth's clothes. We were about the same height, and putting on her hat and closely fitting veil, I set out for Leather Lane. For as many hours as I could possibly contrive to keep up the deception, I was to impersonate Mrs. Tadworth in her own house. As I dare say you have guessed by now, that lady was not in affluent circumstances, and the house in a small by-street off Leather Lane did not boast of a staff of servants. In fact, Mrs. Tadworth did all the domestic work herself, with the help of a charwoman for a couple of hours in the mornings. That charwoman had, in accordance with Lady Molly's plan, been given a week's wages in lieu of notice. I, as Mrs. Tadworth, would be supposed the next day to be confined to my room with a cold, and Emily, our own little maid, a bright girl, who would go through fire and water for Lady Molly or for me, would represent a new charwoman. As soon as anything occurred to arouse my suspicions that our secret had been discovered, I was to wire Lady Molly at the various points which she gave me. Thus provided with an important and comprehensive part, I duly installed myself at Bread Street, Leather Lane. Emily, who had been told just enough of the story and no more to make her eager, excited, and satisfied, entered into the spirit of her rôle as eagerly as I did myself. That first night was quite uneventful. The Piattis came home some time after 11 and went straight up to their room. Emily, looking as like a bedraggled charwoman as her trim figure would allow, was in the hall the next morning when the 2 men started off for breakfast. She told me afterwards that the younger one looked at her very keenly and asked her why the other servant had gone. Emily replied with due and proper vagueness, whereupon the Sicilians said no more and went out together. That was a long and wearisome day, which I spent cooped up in the tiny stuffy parlour, ceaselessly watching the tiny patch of ground at the back, devoured with anxiety, following the travellers in my mind on their way across Europe. Towards midday one of the Piattis came home and presently strolled out into the garden. Evidently the change of servants had aroused his suspicions, for I could see him feeling about the earth with his spade and looking up now and again towards the window of the parlour, whereat I contrived to show him the form of a pseudo-Mrs. Tadworth moving about the room. Mr. Shuttleworth and I were having supper in that same back parlour at about 9 o'clock on that memorable evening, when we suddenly heard the front door being opened with a latchkey, and then very cautiously shut again. One of the 2 men had returned at an hour most unusual for their otherwise very regular habits. The way, too, in which the door had been opened and shut suggested a desire for secrecy and silence. Instinctively I turned off the gas in the parlour, and with a quick gesture pointed to the front room, the door of which stood open, and I whispered hurriedly to Mr. Shuttleworth, "Speak to him." Fortunately, the great aim which he had in view had rendered his perceptions very keen. He went into the front room, in which the gas, fortunately, was alight at the time, and opening the door which gave thence onto the passage, he said pleasantly, "Oh, Mr. Piatti, is that you? Can I do anything for you?" "Ah, yes, thank you," replied the Sicilian, whose voice I could hear was husky and unsteady. "If you would be so kind. I feel so fainting and queer tonight. The warm weather, I think. Would you be so kind to fetch me a little ammoniac or sal volatile you call it, I think, from the apothecary? I would go to lie on my bed if you would be so kind." "Why, of course I will, Mr. Piatti," said Mr. Shuttleworth, who somehow got an intuition of what I wanted to do, and literally played into my hands. "I'll go at once." He went to get his hat from the rack in the hall, whilst the Sicilian murmured profuse "thank yous," and I heard the front door bang to. From where I was I could not see Piatti, but I imagined him standing in the dimly lighted passage listening to Mr. Shuttleworth's retreating footsteps. Presently I heard him walking along towards the back door, and soon I perceived something moving about in the little bit of ground beyond. He had gone to get his spade. He meant to unearth the coat and watch and chain which, for some reason or another, he must have thought were no longer safe in their original hiding place. Had the gang of murderers heard that the man who frequently visited their landlady was the father of Cecil Shuttleworth over at Palermo? At that moment I paused neither to speculate nor yet to plan. I ran down to the kitchen, for I no longer wanted to watch Piatti. I knew what he was doing. I didn't want to frighten Emily, and she had been made to understand all along that she might have to leave the house with me again at any time, at a moment's notice. She and I had kept our small handbag ready packed in the kitchen, whence we could reach the area steps quickly and easily. Now I quietly beckoned to her that the time had come. She took the bag and followed me. Just as we shut the area gate behind us, we heard the garden door violently slammed. Piatti had got the coat, and by now was examining the pockets in order to find the watch and chain. Within the next 10 seconds he would realize that the coat which he held was not the one which he had buried in the garden, and that the real proofs of his guilt, or his complicity in the guilt of another, had disappeared. We did not wait for those 10 seconds, but flew down Bread Street in the direction of Leather Lane, where I knew Mr. Shuttleworth would be on the lookout for me. "Yes," I said hurriedly, directly I spied him at the angle of the street. "It's all up. I am off to Budapest by the early Continental to-morrow morning. I shall catch them at the Hungaria. See Emily safely to the flat." Obviously there was no time to lose, and before either Mr. Shuttleworth or Emily could make a remark, I had left them standing, and had quickly mixed my insignificant personality with the passers-by. I strolled down Leather Lane quite leisurely, you see. My face was unknown to the Piattis. They had only seen dim outlines of me behind very dirty window-panes. I did not go to the flat. I knew Mr. Shuttleworth would take care of Emily, so that night I slept at the Grand Hotel, Charing Cross, leaving the next morning by the 9 a.m., having booked my berth on the Orient Express as far as Budapest. The Irish Tweed Coat, Part 3. Well, you know the saying, it is easy to be wise after the event. Of course, when I saw the older Piatti standing in the hall of the Hotel Hungaria at Budapest, I realized that I had been followed from the moment that Emily and I ran out of the house at Bread Street. The son had obviously kept me in view whilst I was still in London, and the father had travelled across Europe, unperceived by me, in the same train as myself, had seen me step into the fiacre at Budapest, and heard me tell the smart coachman to drive to the Hungaria. I made hasty arrangements for my room, and then asked if Mrs. Carey from London was still at the hotel with her maid, for that was the name under which Mrs. Tadworth was to travel, and was answered in the affirmative. Mrs. Carey was even then supping in the dining-room, whence the strains of beautiful Hungarian melodies played by Burke's inimitable band seemed to mock my anxiety. Mrs. Carey's maid, they told me, was having her meal in the steward's room. I tried to prosecute my hasty inquiries as quietly as I could, but Piatti's eyes and sarcastic smile seemed to follow me everywhere, whilst he went about calmly ordering his room and seeing to the disposal of his luggage. Almost every official at the Hungaria speaks English, and I had no difficulty in finding my way to the steward's room. To my chagrin, Lady Molly was not there. Someone told me that no doubt Mrs. Carey's maid had gone back to her mistress's room, which they told me was number 118 on the first floor. A few precious moments were thus wasted whilst I ran back towards the hall. You know the long, seemingly interminable corridors and passages of the Hungaria. Fortunately, in one of these I presently beheld my dear lady walking towards me. At sight of her all my anxiety seemed to fall from me like a discarded mantle. She looked quite serene and placid, but with her own quick perception she at once guessed what had brought me to Budapest. "They have found out about the coat," she said, quickly drawing me aside into one of the smaller passages, which fortunately at the moment was dark and deserted. "And of course he has followed you." I nodded affirmatively. "That Mrs. Tadworth is a vapid, weak-kneed little fool," she said with angry vehemence. "We ought to be at Cividale by now, and she declared herself too ill and too fatigued to continue the journey. How that poor Shuttleworth could be so blind as to trust her passes belief. Mary," she said more calmly, "go down into the hall at once. Watch that idiot of a woman for all you're worth. She is terrified of the Sicilians, and I firmly believe that Piatti can force her to give up the proofs of the crime to him." "Where are they? The proofs, I mean?" I asked anxiously. "Locked up in her trunk. She won't entrust them to me. Obstinate little fool." I had never seen my dear lady so angry. However, she said nothing more then, and presently I took leave of her and worked my way back towards the hall. One glance round the brilliantly lighted place assured me that neither Piatti nor Mrs. Tadworth was there. I could not tell you what it was that suddenly filled my heart with foreboding. I ran up to the first floor and reached room number 118. The outer door was open, and without a moment's hesitation I applied my eye to the keyhole of the inner one. The room was brilliantly lighted from within, and exactly opposite, but with his back to me, stood Piatti, while squatting on a low stool beside him was Mrs. Tadworth. A trunk stood open close to her hand, and she was obviously busy turning over its contents. My very heart stood still with horror. Was I about to witness, thus powerless to interfere, one of the most hideous acts of cowardly treachery it was possible to conceive? Something, however, must at that moment have attracted Piatti's attention, for he suddenly turned and strode towards the door. Needless to say that I beat a hasty retreat. My one idea was, of course, to find Lady Molly and tell her what I had seen. Unfortunately, the Hungaria is a veritable maze of corridors, stairs, and passages, and I did not know the number of her room. At first I did not wish to attract further attention by again asking about Mrs. Carey's maid at the office, and my stupid ignorance of foreign languages precluded my talking to the female servants. I had been up and down the stairs half a dozen times, tired, miserable, and anxious, when at last, in the far distance, I espied my dear lady's graceful silhouette. Eagerly I ran to her, and was promptly admonished for my careless impetuosity. "Mrs. Tadworth is genuinely frightened," added Lady Molly in response to my look of painful suspense, "but so far she has been able to hoodwink Piatti by opening my trunk before him instead of hers, and telling him that the proofs were not in her own keeping. But she is too stupid to keep that deception up, and of course he won't allow himself to be put off a second time. We must start for Cividale as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the earliest train is not till 9:15 tomorrow morning. The danger to that unfortunate young man over at Palermo, brought about by this woman's cowardly idiocy and the father's misguided trust, is already incalculable." It was, of course, useless for me to express fear now for my dear lady's safety. I smothered my anxiety as best I could, and full of deadly forebodings, I bade her anon a fond good night. Needless to say that I scarcely slept, and at 8 o'clock the next morning I was fully dressed and out of my room. The first glance down the corridor on which gave number 118 at once confirmed my worst fears. Unusual bustle reigned there at this early hour. Officials came and went, maids stood about gossiping, and the next moment, to my literally agonized horror, I beheld 2 gendarmes, with an officer, being escorted by the hotel manager to the rooms occupied by Mrs. Tadworth and Lady Molly. Oh, how I cursed then our British ignorance of foreign tongues! The officials were too busy to bother about me, and the maids only knew that portion of the English language which refers to baths and to hot water. Finally, to my intense relief, I discovered a willing porter, ready and able to give me information in my own tongue, of the events which had disturbed the serene quietude of the Hotel Hungaria. Great heavens! Shall I ever forget what I endured when I grasped the full meaning of what he told me with a placid smile and a shrug of the shoulders? "The affair is most mysterious," he explained. "Not robbery. Oh, no, no, for it is Mrs. Carey who has gone, disappeared, and it is Mrs. Carey's maid who was found, stunned, gagged, and unconscious, tied to one of the bedposts in room number 118. The Irish Tweed Coat, Part 4. Well, why should I bore you by recounting the agonized suspense, the mortal anxiety, which I endured for all those subsequent weary days, which at the time seemed like so many centuries? My own dear lady, the woman for whom I would have gone through fire and water with a cheerful smile, had been brutally assaulted, almost murdered, so the smiling porter assured me, and my very existence was ignored by the stolid officials, who looked down upon me with a frown of impassive disapproval, whilst I entreated, raged, and stormed alternately, begging to be allowed to go and nurse the sick lady, who was my own dearest friend, dearer than any child could be to its mother. Oh, that awful red tapeism that besets one at every turn, paralyzes and disheartens one! What I suffered I really could not describe. But if I was not allowed to see Lady Molly, at least I was able to wreak vengeance upon her cowardly assailants. Mrs. Tadworth, by her disappearance, had tacitly confessed her participation in the outrage. Of that I had no doubt, but I was equally certain that she was both too stupid and too weak to commit such a crime unaided. Piatti was at the bottom of it all. Without a moment's hesitation I laid information against him through the medium of an interpreter. I accused him boldly of being an accessory to the assault for purposes of robbery. Unswervingly I repeated my story of how I had seen him in close conversation the day before with Mrs. Carey, whose real name I declared to be Mrs. Tadworth. The chief object of the robbery I suggested to be a valuable gold watch and chain, with the initials A.C., belonging to my friend, who had travelled with Mrs. Carey to Budapest as her companion, not her maid. This was a bold move on my part, and I felt reckless, I can tell you. Fortunately, my story was corroborated by the fact that the floor valet had seen Piatti hanging about the corridor outside number 118 at an extraordinarily early hour of the morning. My firm belief was that the wretch had been admitted into the room by that horrid Mrs. Tadworth. He had terrorized her, probably had threatened her life. She had then agreed out of sheer cowardice to deliver to him the proofs of his own guilt in the Palermo murder case, and when Lady Molly, hearing the voices, came out of her own room, Piatti knocked her down lest she should intervene. Mrs. Tadworth thereupon, weak and silly little fool, was seized with panic, and succeeded, no doubt with his help, in leaving the hotel, and probably Budapest, before the outrage was discovered. Why Piatti had not done likewise, I could not conjecture. He seems to have gone back quietly to his own room after that, and it was not till an hour later that the chambermaid, surprised at seeing the door of number 118 slightly ajar, had peeped in, and there was greeted by the awful sight of the maid, gagged, bound, and unconscious. Well, I gained my wish, and had the satisfaction presently of knowing that Piatti, although, mind you, he emphatically denied my story from beginning to end, had been placed under arrest, pending further inquiries. The British consul was very kind to me, though I was not allowed to see my dear lady, who had been removed to the hospital. I heard that the Hungarian police were moving heaven and earth to find Mrs. Carey and bring her to justice. Her disappearance told severely against her, and after 3 days of such intense anxiety as I never wish to live through again, I received a message from the consulate informing me that Mrs. Carey had been arrested at Alsarev, on the Austro-Hungarian frontier, and was even now on her way to Budapest under escort. You may imagine how I quivered with anxiety and with rage when, on the morning after that welcome news, I was told that Mrs. Carey was detained at the gendarmerie, and had asked to see Miss Mary Granard from London, at present residing at the Hotel Hungaria. The impudent wretch! Wanting to see me, indeed! Well, I too wanted to see her, the woman whom I despised as a coward and a traitor, who had betrayed the fond and foolish trust of a stricken father, who had dashed the last hopes of an innocent man in danger of his life, and who, finally, had been the cause of an assault that had all but killed, perhaps, the woman I loved best in the world. I felt like the embodiment of hate and contempt. I loathed the woman, and I hied me in a fiacre to the gendarmerie, escorted by one of the clerks from the consulate, simply thirsting with the desire to tell an ignoble female exactly what I thought of her. I had to wait some 2 or 3 minutes in the bare, barrack-like room of the gendarmerie. Then the door opened, there was a rustle of silk, followed by the sound of measured footsteps of soldiery, and the next moment Lady Molly, serene and placid and, as usual, exquisitely dressed, stood smiling before me. "You have gotten me into this plight, Mary," she said with her merry laugh. "You'll have to get me out of it again." "But I don't understand," was all that I could gasp. "It is very simple, and I'll explain it all fully when we are on our way home to Maida Vale," she said. "For the moment you and Mrs. Tadworth will have to make sundry affidavits that I did not assault my maid nor rob her of a watch and chain. The British consul will help you, and it is only a question of days, and in the meanwhile I may tell you that Budapest prison life is quite interesting, and not so uncomfortable as one would imagine." Of course, the moment she spoke, I got an intuition of what had really occurred, and I can assure you that I was heartily ashamed that I should ever have doubted Lady Molly's cleverness in carrying through successfully so important, so vital a business as the righting of an innocent man. Mrs. Tadworth was pusillanimous and stupid. At Budapest she cried a halt, for she really felt unstrung and ill after the hurried journey, the change of air and food and what not. Lady Molly, however, had no difficulty in persuading her that during the enforced stay of 24 hours at the Hungaria, their two roles should be reversed. Lady Molly would be Mrs. Carey, coming from England, while Mrs. Tadworth would be the maid. My dear lady, not thinking at the time that my knowledge of this fact would be of any importance to her own plans, had not mentioned it to me during the brief interview which I had with her. Then, when Piatti arrived upon the scene, Mrs. Tadworth got into a real panic. Fortunately, she had the good sense, or the cowardice, then and there to entrust the coat and watch and chain to Lady Molly, and when Piatti followed her into her room, she was able to show him that the proofs were not then in her possession. This was the scene which I had witnessed through the keyhole. But, of course, the Sicilian would return to the charge, and equally of course Mrs. Tadworth would sacrifice the Shuttleworths, father and son, to save her own skin. Lady Molly knew that. She is strong, active, and determined. She had a brief hand-to-hand struggle with Mrs. Tadworth that night, and finally succeeded in tying her, half unconscious, to the bedpost, thus assuring herself that for at least 24 hours that vapid little fool would be unable to either act for herself or to betray my dear, intrepid lady's plans. When, the following morning, Piatti opened the door of No. 118, which had purposely been left on the latch, he was greeted with the sight of Mrs. Tadworth, pinioned and half dead with fear, whilst the valuable proofs of his own guilt and young Shuttleworth's innocence had completely disappeared. For remember that Lady Molly's face was not known to him or to his gang, and she had caught the first train to Cividale, even whilst Piatti still believed that he held that silly Mrs. Tadworth in the hollow of his hand. I may as well tell you here that she reached the frontier safely, and was quite sharp enough to seek out Colonel Grassi, and, with the necessary words of explanation, to hand over to him the proofs of young Shuttleworth's innocence. My action in the matter helped her. At the hotel she was supposed to be the mistress, and Mrs. Tadworth the maid, and everyone was told that Mrs. Carey's maid had been assaulted and removed to the hospital. But I denounced Piatti then and there, thinking he had attacked my dear lady, and I got him put under lock and key so quickly that he had not the time to communicate with his associates. Thanks to Colonel Grassi's exertions, young Shuttleworth was acquitted of the charge of murder. But I may as well tell you here that neither Piatti nor his son nor any of that gang were arrested for the crime. The proofs of their guilt, the Irish tweed coat, and the murdered man's watch and chain, were most mysteriously suppressed after young Shuttleworth's advocate had obtained the verdict of "not guilty" for him. Such is the Sicilian police. Mr. Shuttleworth senior evidently knew what he was talking about. Of course, we had no difficulty in obtaining Lady Molly's release. The British consul saw to that. But in Budapest they still call the assault on Mrs. Carey at the Hotel Hungaria a mystery, for she exonerated Lady Molly fully, but she refused to accuse Piatti. She was afraid of him, of course, and so they had to set him free. I wonder where he is now, the wicked old wretch. End of The Irish Tweed Coat, Part 4. Chapter 4, Part 1. Of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, by Baroness Orczy. The Fordwych Castle Mystery, Part 1. Can you wonder that, when some of the ablest of our fellows at the Yard were at their wits' ends to know what to do, the chief instinctively turned to Lady Molly? Surely the Fordwych Castle Mystery, as it was universally called, was a case which more than any other required feminine tact, intuition, and all those qualities of which my dear lady possessed more than her usual share. With the exception of Mr. McKinley, the lawyer, and young Jack d'Albuquerque, there were only women connected with the case. If you have studied Debrett at all, you know as well as I do that the peerage is one of those old English ones which date back some 600 years, and that the present Lady d'Albuquerque is a baroness in her own right, the title and estates descending to heirs general. If you have perused that same interesting volume carefully, you will also have discovered that the late Lord d'Albuquerque had two daughters, the eldest, Clementina Cecilia, the present baroness, who succeeded him, the other, Margaret Florence, who married in 1884 Jean-Laurent Duplessis, a Frenchman, whom Debrett vaguely describes as of Pondicherry, India, and of whom she had issue two daughters, Henriette Marie, heir now to the ancient barony of d'Albuquerque of Fordwych, and Joan, born 2 years later. There seems to have been some mystery or romance attached to this marriage of the Honourable Margaret Florence d'Alboukirk to the dashing young officer of the Foreign Legion. Old Lord d'Alboukirk at the time was British Ambassador in Paris, and he seems to have had grave objections to the union. But Miss Margaret, openly flouting her father's displeasure, and throwing prudence to the winds, ran away from home one fine day with Captain Duplessis, and from Pondicherry wrote a curt letter to her relatives, telling them of her marriage with the man she loved best in all the world. Old Lord d'Alboukirk never got over his daughter's wilfulness. She had been his favourite, it appears, and her secret marriage and deceit practically broke his heart. He was kind to her, however, to the end, and when the first baby girl was born and the young pair seemed to be in straitened circumstances, he made them an allowance until the day of his daughter's death, which occurred 3 years after her elopement, on the birth of her second child. When, on the death of her father, the Honourable Clementina Cecilia came into the title and fortune, she seemed to have thought it her duty to take some interest in her late sister's eldest child, who, failing her own marriage and issue, was heir to the barony of d'Alboukirk. Thus it was that Miss Henriette Marie Duplessis came, with her father's consent, to live with her aunt at Fordwych Castle. Debrett will tell you, moreover, that in 1901 she assumed the name of d'Alboukirk, in lieu of her own, by royal licence. Failing her, the title and estate would devolve firstly on her sister Joan, and subsequently on a fairly distant cousin, Captain John d'Alboukirk, at present a young officer in the Guards. According to her servants, the present Baroness d'Alboukirk is very self-willed, but otherwise neither more nor less eccentric than any North Country old maid would be who had such an exceptional position to keep up in the social world. The one soft trait in her otherwise not very lovable character is her great affection for her late sister's child. Miss Henriette Duplessis d'Alboukirk has inherited from her French father dark eyes and hair, and a somewhat swarthy complexion, but no doubt it is from her English ancestry that she has derived a somewhat masculine frame and a very great fondness for all outdoor pursuits. She is very athletic, knows how to fence and to box, rides to hounds, and is a remarkably good shot. From all accounts, the first hint of trouble in that gorgeous home was coincident with the arrival at Fordwych of a young, very pretty girl visitor, who was attended by her maid, a half-caste woman, dark-complexioned and surly of temper, but obviously of dog-like devotion towards her young mistress. This visit seems to have come as a surprise to the entire household at Fordwych Castle, her ladyship having said nothing about it until the very morning that the guests were expected. She then briefly ordered one of the housemaids to get a bedroom ready for the young lady, and to put up a small camp bedstead in an adjoining dressing-room. Even Miss Henriette seems to have been taken by surprise at the announcement of this visit, for, according to Jane Taylor, the housemaid in question, there was a violent word passage between the old lady and her niece, the latter winding up an excited speech with the words, "At any rate, Aunt, there won't be room for both of us in this house," after which she flounced out of the room, banging the door behind her. Very soon the household was made to understand that the newcomer was none other than Miss Joan Duplessis, Miss Henriette's younger sister. It appears that Captain Duplessis had recently died in Pondicherry, and that the young girl then wrote to her aunt, Lady d'Alboukirk, claiming her help and protection, which the old lady naturally considered it her duty to extend to her. It appears that Miss Joan was very unlike her sister, as she was petite and fair, more English-looking than foreign, and had pretty, dainty ways which soon endeared her to the household. The devotion existing between her and the half-caste woman she had brought from India was, moreover, unique. It seems, however, that from the moment these newcomers came into the house, dissensions, often degenerating into violent quarrels, became the order of the day. Henriette seemed to have taken a strong dislike to her younger sister, and most particularly to the latter's dark attendant, who was vaguely known in the house as Runa. That some events of serious import were looming ahead, the servants at Fordwych were pretty sure. The butler and footman at dinner heard scraps of conversation which sounded very ominous. There was talk of lawyers, of proofs, of marriage and birth certificates, quickly suppressed when the servants happened to be about. Her ladyship looked terribly anxious and worried, and she and Miss Henriette spent long hours closeted together in a small boudoir, whence proceeded ominous sounds of heart-rending weeping on her ladyship's part, and angry and violent words from Miss Henriette. Mr. McKinley, the eminent lawyer from London, came down 2 or 3 times to Fordwych, and had long conversations with her ladyship, after which the latter's eyes were very swollen and red. The household thought it more than strange that Roonah, the Indian servant, was almost invariably present at these interviews between Mr. McKinley, her ladyship, and Miss Joan. Otherwise the woman kept herself very much aloof. She spoke very little, hardly took any notice of anyone save her ladyship and her young mistress, and the outbursts of Miss Henriette's temper seemed to leave her quite unmoved. A strange fact was that she had taken a sudden and great fancy for frequenting a small Roman Catholic convent chapel, which was distant about half a mile from the castle, and presently it was understood that Roonah, who had been a Parsee, had been converted by the attendant priest to the Roman Catholic faith. All this happened, mind you, within the last 2 or 3 months. In fact, Miss Joan had been in the castle exactly 12 weeks when Captain Jack d'Alboukirk came to pay his cousin one of his periodical visits. From the first, he seems to have taken a great fancy to his cousin Joan, and soon everyone noticed that this fancy was rapidly ripening into love. It was equally certain that from that moment dissensions between the 2 sisters became more frequent and more violent, the generally accepted opinion being that Miss Henriette was jealous of Joan, whilst Lady d'Alboukirk herself, for some unexplainable reason, seems to have regarded this love-making with marked disfavour. Then came the tragedy. One morning Joan ran downstairs, pale and trembling from head to foot, moaning and sobbing as she ran, "Roonah! My poor Roonah! I knew it! I knew it!" Captain Jack happened to meet her at the foot of the stairs. He pressed her with questions, but the girl was unable to speak. She merely pointed mutely to the floor above. The young man, genuinely alarmed, ran quickly upstairs. He threw open the door leading to Roonah's room, and there, to his horror, he saw the unfortunate woman lying across the small camp bedstead, with a handkerchief over her nose and mouth, her throat cut. The sight was horrible. Poor Roonah was obviously dead. Without losing his presence of mind, Captain Jack quietly shut the door again, after urgently begging Joan to compose herself, and try to keep up, at any rate, until the local doctor could be sent for and the terrible news gently broken to Lady d'Alboukirk. The doctor, hastily summoned, arrived some 20 minutes later. He could but confirm Joan's and Captain Jack's fears. Roonah was indeed dead. In fact, she had been dead some hours. The Fordwych Castle Mystery, Part 2. From the very first, mind you, the public took a more than usually keen interest in this mysterious occurrence. The evening papers on the very day of the murder were ablaze with flaming headlines such as "The Tragedy at Fordwych Castle," "Mysterious Murder of an Important Witness," "Grave Charges Against Persons in High Life," and so forth. As time went on, the mystery deepened more and more, and I suppose Lady Molly must have had an inkling that sooner or later the chief would have to rely on her help and advice, for she sent me down to attend the inquest, and gave me strict orders to keep eyes and ears open for every detail in connection with the crime, however trivial it might seem. She herself remained in town, awaiting a summons from the chief. The inquest was held in the dining-room of Fordwych Castle, and the noble hall was crowded to its utmost when the coroner and jury finally took their seats, after having viewed the body of the poor murdered woman upstairs. The scene was dramatic enough to please any novelist, and an awed hush descended over the crowd when, just before the proceedings began, a door was thrown open, and in walked, stiff and erect, the Baroness d'Alboukirk, escorted by her niece, Miss Henriette, and closely followed by her cousin, Captain Jack of the Guards. The old lady's face was as indifferent and haughty as usual, and so was that of her athletic niece. Captain Jack, on the other hand, looked troubled and flushed. Everyone noted that, directly he entered the room, his eye sought a small, dark figure that sat silent and immovable beside the portly figure of the great lawyer, Mr. Hubert McKinley. This was Miss Joan du Plessis, in a plain black stuff gown, her young face pale and tear-stained. Dr. Walker, the local practitioner, was of course the first witness called. His evidence was purely medical. He deposed to having made an examination of the body, and stated that he found that a handkerchief saturated with chloroform had been pressed to the woman's nostrils, probably while she was asleep, her throat having subsequently been cut with a sharp knife. Death must have been instantaneous, as the poor thing did not appear to have struggled at all. In answer to a question from the coroner, the doctor said that no great force or violence would be required for the gruesome deed, since the victim was undeniably unconscious when it was done. At the same time it argued unusual coolness and determination. The handkerchief was produced, also the knife. The former was a bright-colored one, stated to be the property of the deceased. The latter was a foreign, old-fashioned hunting knife, one of a panoply of small arms and other weapons which adorned a corner of the hall. It had been found by Detective Elliott in a clump of gorse on the adjoining golf links. There could be no question that it had been used by the murderer for his fell purpose, since at the time it was found it still bore traces of blood. Captain Jack was the next witness called. He had very little to say, as he merely saw the body from across the room, and immediately closed the door again, and, having begged his cousin to compose herself, called his own valet and sent him off for the doctor. Some of the staff of Fordwych Castle were called, all of whom testified to the Indian woman's curious taciturnity, which left her quite isolated among her fellow servants. Miss Henriette's maid, however, Jane Partlet, had one or two more interesting facts to record. She seems to have been more intimate with the deceased woman than anyone else, and on one occasion, at least, had quite a confidential talk with her. "She talked chiefly about her mistress," said Jane, in answer to a question from the coroner, "to whom she was most devoted. She told me that she loved her so she would readily die for her. Of course, I thought that silly-like, and just mad foreign talk, but Roonah was very angry when I laughed at her, and then she undid her dress in front and showed me some papers which were sewn in the lining of her dress. 'All these papers my little missy's fortune,' she said to me. 'Roonah guard these with her life. Someone must kill Roonah before taking them from her.' This was about 6 weeks ago," continued Jane, whilst a strange feeling of awe seemed to descend upon all those present whilst the girl spoke. "Lately she had become much more silent, and on my once referring to the papers, she turned on me savage-like and told me to hold my tongue." Asked if she had mentioned the incident of the papers to anyone, Jane replied in the negative. "Except to Miss Henriette, of course," she added, after a slight moment of hesitation. Throughout all these preliminary examinations, Lady d'Alboukirk, sitting between her cousin Captain Jack and her niece Henriette, had remained quite silent, in an erect attitude expressive of haughty indifference. Henriette, on the other hand, looked distinctly bored. Once or twice she had yawned audibly, which caused quite a feeling of anger against her among the spectators. Such callousness in the midst of so mysterious a tragedy, and when her own sister was obviously in such deep sorrow, impressed everyone very unfavourably. It was well known that the young lady had had a fencing lesson, just before the inquest, in the room immediately below that where Roonah lay dead, and that within an hour of the discovery of the tragedy she was calmly playing golf. Then Miss Joan Duplessis was called. When the young girl stepped forward, there was that awed hush in the room which usually falls upon an attentive audience when the curtain is about to rise on the crucial act of a dramatic play. But she was calm and self-possessed, and wonderfully pathetic-looking in her deep black, and with the obvious lines of sorrow which the sad death of a faithful friend had traced on her young face. In answer to the coroner, she gave her name as Joan Clarissa Duplessis, and briefly stated that until the day of her servant's death she had been a resident at Fordwych Castle, but that since then she had left that temporary home and had taken up her abode at the d'Alboukirk Arms, a quiet little hostelry on the outskirts of the town. There was a distinct feeling of astonishment on the part of those who were not aware of this fact, and then the coroner said kindly, "You were born, I think, in Pondicherry in India, and are the younger daughter of Captain and Mrs. Duplessis, who was own sister to her ladyship?" "I was born in Pondicherry," replied the young girl quietly, "and I am the only legitimate child of the late Captain and Mrs. Duplessis, own sister to her ladyship." A wave of sensation, quickly suppressed by the coroner, went through the crowd at these words. The emphasis which the witness had put on the word legitimate could not be mistaken, and everyone felt that here must lie the clue to the so far impenetrable mystery of the Indian woman's death. All eyes were now turned on old Lady d'Alboukirk and on her niece Henriette, but the two ladies were carrying on a whispered conversation together, and had apparently ceased to take any further interest in the proceedings.
"The deceased was your confidential maid, was she not?" asked the coroner after a slight pause.
"Yes."
"She came over to England with you recently?"
"Yes, she had to accompany me in order to help me make good my claim to being my late mother's only legitimate child, and therefore the heir to the barony of d'Alboukirk." Her voice had trembled a little as she said this, but now, as breathless silence reigned in the room, she seemed to make a visible effort to control herself, and replying to the coroner's question, she gave a clear and satisfactory account of her terrible discovery of her faithful servant's death. Her evidence had lasted about a quarter of an hour or so, when suddenly the coroner put the momentous question to her. "Do you know anything about the papers which the deceased woman carried about her person, and reference to which has already been made?" "Yes," she replied quietly. "They were the proofs relating to my claim. My father, Captain Duplessis, had in early youth, and before he met my mother, contracted a secret union with a half-caste woman who was Runa's own sister. Being tired of her, he chose to repudiate her. She had no children, but the legality of the marriage was never for a moment in question. After that, he married my mother, and his first wife subsequently died, chiefly of a broken heart, but her death only occurred 2 months after the birth of my sister Henriette. My father, I think, had been led to believe that his first wife had died some 2 years previously, and he was no doubt very much shocked when he realized what a grievous wrong he had done our mother. In order to mend matters somewhat, he and she went through a new form of marriage, a legal one this time, and my father paid a lot of money to Runa's relatives to have the matter hushed up. Less than a year after this second, and only legal, marriage, I was born, and my mother died."
"Then these papers of which so much has been said, what did they consist of?"
"There were the marriage certificates of my father's first wife, and 2 sworn statements as to her death, 2 months after the birth of my sister Henriette, one by Dr. Renaud, who was at the time a well-known medical man in Pondicherry, and the other by Runa herself, who had held her dying sister in her arms. Dr. Renaud is dead, and now Runa has been murdered, and all the proofs have gone with her." Her voice broke in a passion of sobs, which with manifest self-control she quickly suppressed. In that crowded court you could have heard a pin drop, so great was the tension of intense excitement and attention.
"Then those papers remained in your maid's possession? Why was that?" asked the coroner.
"I did not dare to carry the papers about with me," said the witness, while a curious look of terror crept into her young face as she looked across at her aunt and sister. "Runa would not part with them. She carried them in the lining of her dress, and at night they were all under her pillow. After her death, and when Dr. Walker had left, I thought it my duty to take possession of the papers which meant my whole future to me, and which I desired then to place in Mr. McKinley's charge. But though I carefully searched the bed and all the clothing by my poor Runa's side, I did not find the papers. They were gone." I won't attempt to describe to you the sensation caused by the deposition of this witness. All eyes wandered from her pale young face to that of her sister, who sat almost opposite to her, shrugging her athletic shoulders and gazing at the pathetic young figure before her with callous and haughty indifference.
"Now, putting aside the question of the papers for the moment," said the coroner after a pause, "do you happen to know anything of your late servant's private life? Had she an enemy, or perhaps a lover?"
"No," replied the girl. "Runa's whole life was centered in me and in my claim. I had often begged her to place our papers in Mr. McKinley's charge, but she would trust no one. I wish she had obeyed me," here moaned the girl involuntarily, "and I should not have lost what means my whole future to me, and the being who loved me best in all the world would not have been so foully murdered." Of course it was terrible to see this young girl thus instinctively, and surely unintentionally, proffering so awful an accusation against those who stood so near to her. That the whole case had become hopelessly involved and mysterious, nobody could deny. Can you imagine the mental picture formed in the mind of all present by the story, so pathetically told, of this girl who had come over to England in order to make good her claim which she felt to be just, and who, in one fell swoop, saw that claim rendered very difficult to prove through the dastardly murder of her principal witness? That the claim was seriously jeopardized by the death of Runa and the disappearance of the papers was made very clear, mind you, through the statements of Mr. McKinley, the lawyer. He could not say very much, of course, and his statements could never have been taken as actual proof, because Roonah and Joan had never fully trusted him, and had never actually placed the proofs of the claim in his hands. He certainly had seen the marriage certificate of Captain Duplessis's wife, and a copy of this, as he very properly stated, could easily be obtained. The woman seems to have died during the great cholera epidemic of 1881, when, owing to the great number of deaths which occurred, the deceit and concealment practised by the natives at Pondicherry, and the supineness of the French government, death certificates were very casually and often incorrectly made out. Roonah had come over to England ready to swear that her sister had died in her arms 2 months after the birth of Captain Duplessis's eldest child, and there was the sworn testimony of Dr. Raynaud, since dead. These affidavits Mr. McKinley had seen and read. Against that, the only proof which now remained of the justice of Joan Duplessis's claim was the fact that her mother and father went through a second form of marriage some time after the birth of their first child, Henriette. This fact was not denied, and, of course, it could be easily proved, if necessary. But even then it would in no way be conclusive. It implied the presence of a doubt in Captain Duplessis's mind, a doubt which the second marriage ceremony may have served to set at rest, but it in no way established the illegitimacy of his eldest daughter. In fact, the more Mr. McKinley spoke, the more convinced did everyone become that the theft of the papers had everything to do with the murder of the unfortunate Roonah. She would not part with the proofs which meant her mistress's fortune, and she paid for her devotion with her life. Several more witnesses were called after that. The servants were closely questioned, the doctor was recalled, but in spite of long and arduous efforts, the coroner and jury could not bring a single real fact to light beyond those already stated. The Indian woman had been murdered. The papers which she always carried about her body had disappeared. Beyond that, nothing. An impenetrable wall of silence and mystery. The butler at Fordwych Castle had certainly missed the knife with which Roonah had been killed from its accustomed place on the morning after the murder had been committed, but not before, and the mystery further gained in intensity from the fact that the only purchase of chloroform in the district had been traced to the murdered woman herself. She had gone down to the local chemist one day some 2 or 3 weeks previously and shown him a prescription for cleansing the hair which required some chloroform in it. He gave her a very small quantity in a tiny bottle, which was subsequently found empty on her own dressing table. No one at Fordwych Castle could swear to having heard any unaccustomed noise during that memorable night. Even Joan, who slept in the room adjoining that where the unfortunate Roonah lay, said she had heard nothing unusual. But then the door of communication between the 2 rooms was shut, and the murderer had been quick and silent. Thus this extraordinary inquest drew to a close, leaving in its train an air of dark suspicion and of unexplainable horror. The jury returned a verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown, and the next moment Lady d'Alboukirk rose, and leaning on her niece's arm, quietly walked out of the room. The Fordwych Castle Mystery, Part 3. 2 of our best men from the yard, Pegram and Elliot, were left in charge of the case. They remained at Fordwych, the little town close by, as did Miss Joan, who had taken up her permanent abode at the d'Alboukirk Arms, whilst I returned to town immediately after the inquest. Captain Jack had rejoined his regiment, and apparently the ladies of the castle had resumed their quiet, luxurious life, just the same as heretofore. The old lady led her own somewhat isolated, semi-regal life. Miss Henriette fenced and boxed, played hockey and golf, and over the fine castle and its haughty inmates there hovered like an ugly bird of prey the threatening presence of a nameless suspicion. The 2 ladies might choose to flout public opinion, but public opinion was dead against them. No one dared formulate a charge, but everyone remembered that Miss Henriette had, on the very morning of the murder, been playing golf in the field where the knife was discovered, and that if Miss Joan Duplessis ever failed to make good on her claim to the barony of d'Alboukirk, Miss Henriette would remain in undisputed possession. So now, when the ladies drove past in the village street, no one doffed a cap to salute them, and when at church the parson read out the 6th commandment, "Thou shalt do no murder," all eyes gazed with fearsome awe at the old Baroness and her niece. Splendid isolation reigned at Fordwych Castle. The daily papers grew more and more sarcastic at the expense of the Scotland Yard authorities, and the public more and more impatient. Then it was that the chief grew desperate and sent for Lady Molly, the result of the interview being that I once more made the journey down to Fordwych, but this time in the company of my dear lady, who had received carte blanche from headquarters to do whatever she thought right in the investigation of the mysterious crime. She and I arrived at Fordwych at 8 p.m., after the usual long wait at Newcastle. We put up at the d'Alboukirk Arms, and over a hasty and very bad supper, Lady Molly allowed me a brief insight into her plans. "I can see every detail of that murder, Mary," she said earnestly, "just as if I had lived at the castle all the time. I know exactly where our fellows are wrong, and why they cannot get on. But although the chief has given me a free hand, what I am going to do is so irregular that if I fail I shall probably get my immediate congé, while some of the disgrace is bound to stick to you. It is not too late. You may yet draw back, and leave me to act alone." I looked her straight in the face. Her dark eyes were gleaming. There was the power of second sight in them, or of marvellous intuition of men and things. "I'll follow your lead, my Lady Molly," I said quietly. "Then go to bed now," she replied, with that strange transition of manner which to me was so attractive and to everyone else so unaccountable. In spite of my protests, she refused to listen to any more talk or to answer any more questions, and perforce I had to go to my room. The next morning I saw her graceful figure, immaculately dressed in a perfect tailor-made gown, standing beside my bed at a very early hour. "Why, what is the time?" I ejaculated, suddenly wide awake. "Too early for you to get up," she replied quietly. "I am going to early mass at the Roman Catholic convent close by." "To mass at the Roman Catholic convent?" "Yes. Don't repeat all my words, Mary. It is silly, and wastes time. I have introduced myself in the neighbourhood as the American, Mrs. Silas A. Ogan, whose motor has broken down and is being repaired at Newcastle, while I, its owner, amuse myself by viewing the beauties of the neighbourhood. Being a Roman Catholic, I go to mass first, and having met Lady D'Alboukirk once in London, I go to pay her a respectful visit afterwards. When I come back we will have breakfast together. You might try in the meantime to scrape up an acquaintance with Miss Joan du Plessis, who is staying here, and ask her to join us at breakfast." She was gone before I could make another remark, and I could but obey her instantly to the letter. An hour later I saw Miss Joan du Plessis strolling in the hotel garden. It was not difficult to pass the time of day with the young girl, who seemed quite to brighten up at having someone to talk to. We spoke of the weather and so forth, and I steadily avoided the topic of the Fordwych Castle tragedy until the return of Lady Molly at about 10 o'clock. She came back looking just as smart, just as self-possessed, as when she had started 3 hours earlier. Only I, who knew her so well, noted the glitter of triumph in her eyes, and knew that she had not failed. She was accompanied by Pegram, who, however, immediately left her side and went straight into the hotel, whilst she joined us in the garden, and after a few graceful words, introduced herself to Miss Joan du Plessis, and asked her to join us in the coffee-room upstairs. The room was empty, and we sat down to table, I quivering with excitement and awaiting events. Through the open window I saw Elliot walking rapidly down the village street. Presently the waitress went off, and I being too excited to eat or speak, Lady Molly carried on a running conversation with Miss Joan, asking her about her life in India and her father, Captain du Plessis. Joan admitted that she had always been her father's favourite. "He never liked Henriette, somehow," she explained. Lady Molly asked her when she had first known Roonah. "She came to the house when my mother died," replied Joan, "and she had charge of me as a baby." At Pondicherry no one had thought it strange that she came as a servant into an officer's house, where her own sister had reigned as mistress. Pondicherry is a French settlement, and manners and customs there are often very peculiar. I ventured to ask her what were her future plans. "Well," she said with a great touch of sadness, "I can, of course, do nothing whilst my aunt is alive. I cannot force her to let me live at Fordwych, or to acknowledge me as her heir. After her death, if my sister does assume the title and fortune of d'Alboukirk," she added, whilst suddenly a strange look of vengefulness, almost of hatred and cruelty, marred the childlike expression of her face. Then I shall revive the story of the tragedy of Runa's death, and I hope that public opinion—" She paused here in her speech, and I, who had been gazing out of the window, turned my eyes on her. She was ashy pale, staring straight before her, her hands dropped the knife and fork which she held. Then I saw that Pegram had come into the room, that he had come up to the table and placed a packet of papers in Lady Molly's hand. I saw it all as in a flash. There was a loud cry of despair like an animal at bay, a shrill cry, followed by a deep one from Pegram of "No, you don't!" And before anyone could prevent her, Joan's graceful young figure stood outlined for a moment at the open window. The next moment she had disappeared into the depths below, and we heard a dull thud which nearly froze the blood in my veins. Pegram ran out of the room, but Lady Molly sat quite still. "I have succeeded in clearing the innocent," she said quietly, "but the guilty has meted out to herself her own punishment." "Then it was she?" I murmured, horror-struck. "Yes, I suspected it from the first," replied Lady Molly calmly. "It was this conversion of Runa to Roman Catholicism, and her consequent change of manner, which gave me the first clue." "But why?" I muttered. "A simple reason, Mary," she rejoined, tapping the packet of papers with her delicate hand, and breaking open the string that held the letters, she laid them out upon the table. "The whole thing was a fraud from beginning to end. The woman's marriage certificate was all right, of course, but I mistrusted the genuineness of the other papers from the moment that I heard that Runa would not part with them and would not allow Mr. McKinley to have charge of them. I am sure that the idea at first was merely one of blackmail. The papers were only to be the means of extorting money from the old lady, and there was no thought of taking them into court. Runa's part was, of course, the important thing in the whole case, since she was here prepared to swear to the actual date of the first Madame Duplessis's death. The initiative, of course, may have come either from Joan or from Captain Duplessis himself, out of hatred for the family who would have nothing to do with him and his favourite younger daughter. That, of course, we shall never know. At first Runa was a Parsi, with a dog-like devotion to the girl whom she had nursed as a baby, and who, no doubt, had drilled her well into the part she was to play. But presently she became a Roman Catholic, an ardent convert, remember, with all a Roman Catholic's fear of hellfire. I went to the convent this morning. I heard the priest's sermon there, and I realized what an influence his eloquence must have had over poor, ignorant, superstitious Runa. She was still ready to die for her young mistress, but she was no longer prepared to swear to a lie for her sake. After Mass I called at Fordwych Castle. I explained my position to old Lady d'Alboukirk, who took me into the room where Runa had slept and died. There I found two things," continued Lady Molly, as she opened the elegant reticule which still hung upon her arm, and placed a big key and a prayer-book before me. "The key I found in a drawer of an old cupboard in the dressing-room where Runa slept, with all sorts of odds and ends belonging to the unfortunate woman, and going to the door which led into what had been Joan's bedroom, I found that it was locked, and that this key fitted into the lock. Runa had locked that door herself on her own side. She was afraid of her mistress. I knew now that I was right in my surmise. The prayer-book is a Roman Catholic one. It is heavily thumb-marked there, where false oaths and lying are denounced as being deadly sins, for which hellfire would be the punishment. Runa, terrorized by the fear of the supernatural, a new convert to the faith, was afraid of committing a deadly sin. Who knows what passed between the two women, both of whom have come to so violent and terrible an end? Who can tell what prayers, tears, persuasions Joan Duplessis employed from the time she realized that Runa did not mean to swear to the lie which would have brought her mistress wealth and glamour, until the awful day when she finally understood that Runa would no longer even hold her tongue, and devised a terrible means of silencing her forever. With this certainty before me, I ventured on my big coup. I was so sure, you see. I kept Joan talking in here whilst I sent Pegram to her room, with orders to break open the locks of her handbag and dressing-case. There, I told you that if I was wrong, I would probably be dismissed from the force for irregularity, as of course I had no right to do that. But if Pegram found the papers there where I felt sure they would be, we could bring the murderer to justice. I know my own sex pretty well, don't I, Mary? I knew that Joan Duplessis had not destroyed, never would destroy, those papers. Even as Lady Molly spoke, we could hear heavy tramping outside the passage. I ran to the door, and there was met by Pegram. "She is quite dead, miss," he said. "It was a drop of 40 feet, and a stone pavement down below." The guilty had indeed meted out her own punishment to herself. Lady Albuquerque sent Lady Molly a cheque for £5,000 the day the whole affair was made known to the public. I think you will say that it had been well earned. With her own dainty hands, my dear lady had lifted the veil which hung over the tragedy of Fordwych Castle, and with the finding of the papers in Joan Duplessis's dressing bag, and the unfortunate girl's suicide, the murder of the Indian woman was no longer a mystery. End of Part 3 of the Fordwych Castle Mystery. Chapter 5, Part 1 of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, by Baroness Orczy. A Day's Folly, Part 1. I don't think that anyone ever knew that the real elucidation of the extraordinary mystery known to the newspaper-reading public as the Somersetshire outrage was evolved in my own dear lady's quick, intuitive brain. As a matter of fact, to this day, as far as the public is concerned, the Somersetshire outrage never was properly explained, and it is a very usual thing for those busybodies who are so fond of criticizing the police to point to that case as an instance of remarkable incompetence on the part of our detective department. A young woman named Jane Turner, a visitor at Weston-super-Mare, had been discovered one afternoon in a helpless condition, bound and gagged and suffering from terror and inanition, in the bedroom which she occupied in a well-known apartment house of that town. The police had been immediately sent for, and as soon as Miss Turner had recovered, she gave what explanation she could of the mysterious occurrence. She was employed in one of the large drapery shops in Bristol, and was spending her annual holiday at Weston-super-Mare. Her father was the local butcher at Banwell, a village distant about 4 miles from Weston, and it appears that somewhere near 1 o'clock in the afternoon of Friday, the 3rd of September, she was busy in her bedroom putting a few things together in a handbag, preparatory to driving out to Banwell, meaning to pay her parents a week-end visit. There was a knock at her door, and a voice said, "It's me, Jane. May I come in?" She did not recognize the voice, but somehow thought that it must be that of a friend, so she shouted, "Come in." This was all that the poor thing recollected definitely, for the next moment the door was thrown open, someone rushed at her with amazing violence, she heard the crash of a falling table and felt a blow on the side of her head, whilst a damp handkerchief was pressed to her nose and mouth. Then she remembered nothing more. When she gradually came to her senses, she found herself in the terrible plight in which Mrs. Skeward, her landlady, discovered her 24 hours later. When pressed to try and describe her assailant, she said that when the door was thrown open, she thought that she saw an elderly woman in a wide mantle and wearing bonnet and veil, but that, at the same time, she was quite sure, from the strength and brutality of the onslaught, that she was attacked by a man. She had no enemies, and no possessions worth stealing, but her handbag, which however only contained a few worthless trifles, had certainly disappeared. The people of the house, on the other hand, could throw but little light on the mystery which surrounded this very extraordinary and seemingly purposeless assault. Mrs. Skeward only remembered that on Friday Miss Turner told her that she was just off to Banwell, and would be away for the week-end, but that she wished to keep her room on against her return on the Monday following. That was something about 12:30 o'clock, at the hour when luncheons were being got ready for the various lodgers. Small wonder, therefore, that no one in the busy apartment house took much count of the fact that Miss Turner was not seen to leave the house after that, and no doubt the wretched girl would have been left for several days in the pitiable condition in which she was ultimately found, but for the fact that Mrs. Skeward happened to be of the usual grasping type common to those of her kind. Weston-super-Mare was overfull that week-end, and Mrs. Skeward, beset by applicants for accommodation, did not see why she should not let her absent lodger's room for the night or two that the latter happened to be away, and thus get money twice over for it. She conducted a visitor up to Miss Turner's room on the Saturday afternoon, and throwing open the door, which, by the way, was not locked, was horrified to see the poor girl half sitting, half slipping off the chair to which she had been tied with a rope, whilst a woolen shawl was wound round the lower part of her face. As soon as she had released the unfortunate victim, Mrs. Skeward sent for the police, and it was through the intelligent efforts of Detective Parsons, a local man, that a few scraps of very hazy evidence were then and there collected. First there was the question of the elderly female in the wide mantle, spoken of by Jane Turner as her assailant. It seems that someone answering to that description had called on the Friday at about 1 o'clock and asked to see Miss Turner. The maid who answered the door replied that she thought Miss Turner had gone to Banwell. "Oh," said the old dame, "she won't have started yet. I am Miss Turner's mother, and I was to call for her so that we might drive out together." "Then p'raps Miss Turner is still in her room," suggested the maid. "Shall I go and see?" "Don't trouble," replied the woman. "I know my way. I'll go myself." Whereupon the old dame walked past the servant, crossed the hall, and went upstairs. No one saw her come down again, but one of the lodgers seems to have heard a knock at Jane Turner's door, and the female voice saying, "It's me, Jane. May I come in?" What happened subsequently, who the mysterious old female was, and how and for what purpose she assaulted Jane Turner and robbed her of a few valueless articles, was the puzzle which faced the police then, and which, so far as the public is concerned, has never been solved. Jane Turner's mother was in bed at the time, suffering from a broken ankle and unable to move. The elderly woman was, therefore, an impostor, and the search for her, though keen and hot enough at the time, I assure you, has remained, in the eyes of the public, absolutely fruitless. But of this more anon. On the actual scene of the crime there was but little to guide subsequent investigation. The rope with which Jane Turner had been pinioned supplied no clue. The wool shawl was Miss Turner's own, snatched up by the miscreant to smother the girl's screams. On the floor was a handkerchief, without initial or laundry mark, which obviously had been saturated with chloroform, and close by a bottle which had contained the anesthetic. A small table was overturned, and the articles which had been resting upon it were lying all around, such as a vase which had held a few flowers, a box of biscuits, and several issues of the West of England Times. And nothing more. The miscreant, having accomplished his fell purpose, succeeded evidently in walking straight out of the house unobserved, his exit being undoubtedly easily managed, owing to it being the busy luncheon hour. Various theories were, of course, put forward by some of our ablest fellows at the Yard, the most likely solution being the guilt or, at least, the complicity of the girl's sweetheart, Arthur Cutbush, a ne'er-do-well who spent the greater part of his time on racecourses. Inspector Danvers, whom the chief had sent down to assist the local police, declared that Jane Turner herself suspected her sweetheart, and was trying to shield him by stating she possessed nothing of any value, whereas, no doubt, the young blackguard knew that she had some money, and had planned this amazing coup in order to rob her of it. Danvers was quite chagrined when, on investigation, it was proved that Arthur Cutbush had gone to the York races 3 days before the assault, and never left that city until the Saturday evening, when a telegram from Miss Turner summoned him to Weston. Moreover, the girl did not break off her engagement with young Cutbush, and thus the total absence of motive was a serious bar to the likelihood of the theory. Then it was that the chief sent for Lady Molly. No doubt he began to feel that here, too, was a case where feminine tact, and my lady's own marvellous intuition, might prove more useful than the more approved methods of the sterner sex. A Day's Folly, Part 2. "Of course there is a woman in the case, Mary," said Lady Molly to me, when she came home from the interview with the chief, "although they all pooh-pooh that theory at the Yard, and declare that the female voice, to which the only 2 witnesses we have are prepared to swear, was a disguised one." "You think, then, that a woman assaulted Jane Turner?" "Well," she replied somewhat evasively, "if a man assumes a feminine voice, the result is a high-pitched, unnatural treble, and that, I feel convinced, would have struck either the maid or the lodger, or both, as peculiar." This was the train of thought which my dear lady and I were following up, when, with that sudden transition of manner so characteristic of her, she said abruptly to me, "Mary, look out a train for Weston-super-Mare. We must try to get down there tonight." "Chief's orders?" I asked. "No, mine," she replied laconically. "Where's the ABC?" Well, we got off that self-same afternoon, and in the evening we were having dinner at the Grand Hotel, Weston-super-Mare. My dear lady had been pondering all through the journey, and even now she was singularly silent and absorbed. There was a deep frown between her eyes, and every now and then the luminous, dark orbs would suddenly narrow, and the pupils contract as if smitten with a sudden light. I was not a little puzzled as to what was going on in that active brain of hers, but my experience was that silence on my part was the surest card to play. Lady Molly had entered our names in the hotel book as Mrs. Walter Bell and Miss Granard from London, and the day after our arrival there came 2 heavy parcels for her under that name. She had them taken upstairs to our private sitting room, and there we undid them together. To my astonishment, they contained stacks of newspapers. As far as I could see at a glance, back numbers of the West of England Times covering a whole year. "Find and cut out the personal column of every number, Mary," said Lady Molly to me. "I'll look through them on my return. I'm going for a walk, and will be home by lunch-time." I knew, of course, that she was intent on her business, and on that only, and as soon as she had gone out I set myself to the wearisome tasks which she had allotted me. My dear lady was evidently working out a problem in her mind, the solution of which she expected to find in a back number of the West of England Times. By the time she returned I had the personal column of some 300 numbers of the paper neatly filed and docketed for her perusal. She thanked me for my promptitude with one of her charming looks, but said little, if anything, all through luncheon. After that meal she set to work. I could see her studying each scrap of paper minutely, comparing one with the other, arranging them in sets in front of her, and making marginal notes on them all the while. With but a brief interval for tea, she sat at her table for close on 4 hours, at the end of which she swept all the scraps of paper on one side, with the exception of a few which she kept in her hand. Then she looked up at me, and I sighed with relief. My lady was positively beaming. "You have found what you wanted?" I asked eagerly. "What I expected," she replied. "May I know?" She spread out the bits of paper before me. There were 6 altogether, and each of these columns had one paragraph specially marked with a cross. "Only look at the paragraphs which I have marked," she said. I did what I was told, but if in my heart I had vaguely hoped that I should then and there be confronted with the solution of the mystery which surrounded the Somersetshire outrage, I was doomed to disappointment. Each of the marked paragraphs in the personal columns bore the initials HSH, and their purport was invariably an assignation at one of the small railway stations on the line between Bristol and Weston. I suppose that my bewilderment must have been supremely comical, for my lady's rippling laugh went echoing through the bare, dull hotel sitting-room. "You don't see it, Mary?" she asked gaily. "I confess I don't," I replied. "It completely baffles me. And yet," she said more gravely, "those few silly paragraphs have given me the clue to the mysterious assault on Jane Turner, which has been puzzling our fellows at the Yard for over 3 weeks." "But how? I don't understand." "You will, Mary, directly we get back to town. During my morning walk I have learnt all that I want to know, and now these paragraphs have set my mind at rest." A Day's Folly, Part 3. The next day we were back in town. Already at Bristol we had bought a London morning paper, which contained in its centre page a short notice under the following startling headlines: "The Somersetshire Outrage. Amazing discovery by the police. An unexpected clue." The article went on to say, "We are officially informed that the police have recently obtained knowledge of certain facts which establish beyond a doubt the motive of the brutal assault committed on the person of Miss Jane Turner. We are not authorized to say more at present than that certain startling developments are imminent." On the way up my dear lady had initiated me into some of her views with regard to the case itself, which at the chief's desire she had now taken entirely in hand, and also into her immediate plans, of which the above article was merely the preface. She it was who had officially informed the Press Association, and needless to say, the news duly appeared in most of the London and provincial dailies. How unerring was her intuition, and how well thought out her scheme, was proved within the next 24 hours in our own little flat, when our Emily, looking somewhat important and awed, announced, "Her Serene Highness the Countess of Hohengebirg." HSH, the conspicuous initials in the personal columns of the West of England Times! You may imagine how I stared at the exquisite apparition, all lace and chiffon and roses, which the next moment literally swept into our office, past poor open-mouthed Emily. Had my dear lady taken leave of her senses when she suggested that this beautiful young woman with the soft fair hair, with the pleading blue eyes and childlike mouth, had anything to do with a brutal assault on a shop girl? The young Countess shook hands with Lady Molly and with me, and then, with a deep sigh, she sank into the comfortable chair which I was offering her. Speaking throughout with great diffidence, but always in the gentle tones of a child that knows it has been naughty, she began by explaining that she had been to Scotland Yard, where a very charming man, the chief, I presume, had been most kind and sent her hither, where he promised her she would find help and consolation in her dreadful, dreadful trouble. Encouraged by Lady Molly, she soon plunged into her narrative, a pathetic tale of her own frivolity and foolishness. She was originally Lady Muriel Wolfe-Strongham, daughter of the Duke of Weston, and when scarce out of the schoolroom had met the Grand Duke of Starkburg-Nauheim, who fell in love with her and married her. The union was a morganatic one, the Grand Duke conferring on his English wife the title of the Countess of Hohengebirg and the rank of Serene Highness. It seems that, at first, the marriage was a fairly happy one, in spite of the bitter animosity of the mother and sister of the Grand Duke, the Dowager Grand Duchess holding that all English girls were loud and unwomanly, and the Princess Amélie seeing in her brother's marriage a serious bar to the fulfilment of her own highly ambitious matrimonial hopes. "They can't bear me, because I don't knit socks, and I don't know how to bake almond cakes," said her dear little Serene Highness, looking up with tender appeal at Lady Molly's grave and beautiful face, "and they will be so happy to see a real estrangement between my husband and myself." It appears that last year, while the Grand Duke was doing his annual cure at Marienbad, the Countess of Hohengebirg went to Folkestone for the benefit of her little boy's health. She stayed at one of the hotels there merely as any English lady of wealth might do, with nurses and her own maid, of course, but without the paraphernalia and nuisance of her usual German retinue. Whilst there she met an old acquaintance of her father's, a Mr. Rumbold, who is a rich financier, it seems, and who at one time moved in the best society, but whose reputation had greatly suffered recently, owing to a much-talked-of divorce case which brought his name into unenviable notoriety. Her Serene Highness, with more mopping of her blue eyes, assured Lady Molly that over at Schloss Starkburg she did not read the English papers, and was therefore quite unaware that Mr. Rumbold, who used to be a persona grata in her father's house, was no longer a fit and proper acquaintance for her. "It was a very fine morning," she continued with genuine pathos, "and I was deadly dull at Folkestone. Mr. Rumbold persuaded me to go with him on a short trip on his yacht. We were to cross over to Boulogne, have lunch there, and come home in the cool of the evening. And, of course, something occurred to disable the yacht," concluded Lady Molly gravely, as the lady herself had paused in her narrative. "Of course," whispered the little Countess through her tears. "And of course it was too late to get back by the ordinary afternoon mail boat?" "That boat had gone an hour before, and the next did not leave until the middle of the night." "So you perforce had to wait then, and in the meanwhile you were seen by a girl named Jane Turner, who knew you by sight, and who has been blackmailing you ever since." "How did you guess that?" ejaculated her Highness, with a look of such comical bewilderment in her large blue eyes that Lady Molly and I had perforce to laugh. "Well," replied my dear lady after a while, resuming her gravity, "we have a way in our profession of putting two and two together, haven't we? And in this case it was not very difficult. The assignations for secret meetings at out-of-the-way railway stations, which were addressed to H.S.H. in the columns of the West of England Times recently, gave me one clue, shall we say? The mysterious assault on a young woman whose home was close to those very railway stations, as well as to Bristol Castle, your parents' residence, where you have frequently been staying of late, was another piece that fitted in the puzzle, whilst the number of copies of the West of England Times that were found in that same young woman's room helped to draw my thoughts to her. Then your visit to me to-day. It is very simple, you see." "I suppose so," said H.S.H. with a sigh. "Only it is worse even than you suggest, for that horrid Jane Turner, to whom I had been ever so kind when I was a girl, took a snapshot of me and Mr. Rumbold standing on the steps of Hôtel des Bains at Boulogne. I saw her doing it, and rushed down the steps to stop her. She talked quite nicely then, hypocritical wretch, and said that perhaps the plate would be no good when it was developed, and if it were she would destroy it. I was not to worry. She would contrive to let me know through the agony column of the West of England Times, which, as I was going home to Bristol Castle to stay with my parents, I could see every day.
but she had no idea I should have minded, and all that sort of rigmarole. Oh, she's a wicked girl, isn't she, to worry me so?" And once again the lace handkerchief found its way to the most beautiful pair of blue eyes I think I have ever seen. I could not help smiling, though I was really very sorry for the silly, emotional, dear little thing. "And instead of reassurance in the West of England Times, you found a demand for a secret meeting at a country railway station?" "Yes, and when I went there, terrified lest I should be seen, Jane Turner did not meet me herself. Her mother came, and at once talked of selling the photograph to my husband or to my mother-in-law. She said it was worth £4,000 to Jane, and that she had advised her daughter not to sell it to me for less." "What did you reply?" "That I hadn't got £4,000, said the Countess ruefully. "So after a lot of argument it was agreed that I was to pay Jane £250 a year out of my dress allowance. She would keep the negative as security, but promised never to let anyone see it so long as she got her money regularly. It was also arranged that whenever I stayed with my parents at Bristol Castle, Jane would make appointments to meet me through the columns of the West of England Times, and I was to pay up the instalments then just as she directed." I could have laughed if the whole thing had not been so tragic, for truly the way this silly, harmless little woman had allowed herself to be bullied and blackmailed by a pair of grasping females was beyond belief. "And this has been going on for over a year?" commented Lady Molly gravely. "Yes, but I never met Jane Turner again. It was always her mother who came." "You knew her mother before that, I presume?" "Oh, no. I only knew Jane because she had been sewing maid at the castle some few years ago." "I see," said Lady Molly slowly. "What was the woman like whom you used to meet at the railway stations, and to whom you paid over Miss Turner's money?" "Oh, I couldn't tell you what she was like. I never saw her properly." "Never saw her properly?" ejaculated Lady Molly, and it seemed to my well-trained ears as if there was a ring of exultation in my dear lady's voice. "No," replied the little Countess ruefully. "She always appointed a late hour of the evening, and those little stations on that line are very badly lighted. I had difficulties getting away from home without exciting comment, and used to beg her to let me meet her at a more convenient hour, but she always refused." Lady Molly remained thoughtful for a while, then she asked abruptly, "Why don't you prosecute Jane Turner for blackmail?" "Oh, I dare not! I dare not!" ejaculated the little Countess in genuine terror. "My husband would never forgive me, and his female relations would do their best afterwards to widen the breach between us. It was because of the article in the London newspaper about the assault on Jane Turner, the talk of a clue and of startling developments, that I got terrified and went to Scotland Yard. Oh, no, no, no! Promise me that my name won't be dragged into this case. It would ruin me for ever." She was sobbing now. Her grief and fear were very pathetic to witness, and she moaned through her sobs. "Those wicked people know that I daren't risk an exposure, and simply prey on me like vampires because of that. The last time I saw the old woman, I told her that I would confess everything to my husband. I couldn't bear to go on like this. But she only laughed. She knew I should never dare." "When was this?" asked Lady Molly. "About 3 weeks ago, just before Jane Turner was assaulted and robbed of the photographs." "How do you know she was robbed of the photographs?" "She wrote and told me so," replied the young Countess, who seemed strangely awed now by my dear lady's earnest question, and from a dainty reticule she took a piece of paper, which bore traces of many bitter tears on its crumpled surface. This she handed to Lady Molly, who took it from her. It was a typewritten letter, which bore no signature. Lady Molly perused it in silence first, then read its contents out aloud to me. "To H.S.H., the Countess of Hohengemberg. You think I have been worrying you the past 12 months about your adventure with Mr. Rumbold in Bologna. But it was not me. It was one who has power over me, and who knew about the photograph. He made me act as I did. But whilst I kept the photo you were safe. Now he has assaulted me and nearly killed me, and taken the negative away. I can and will get it out of him again, but it will mean a large sum down. Can you manage £1,000? "When did you get this?" asked Lady Molly. "Only a few days ago," replied the Countess. "And oh, I have been enduring agonies of doubt and fear for the past 3 weeks, for I had heard nothing from Jane since the assault, and I wondered what had happened." "You have not sent a reply, I hope?"
"No, I was going to, when I saw the article in the London paper, and the fear that all had been discovered threw me into such a state of agony that I came straight up to town and saw the gentleman at Scotland Yard who sent me to you. Oh," she entreated again and again, "you won't do anything that will cause a scandal. Promise me, promise me. I believe I should commit suicide rather than face it, and I could find £1,000. "I don't think you will need to do either," said Lady Molly. "Now, may I think over the whole matter quietly to myself," she added, "and talk it over with my friend here? I may be able to let you have some good news shortly." She rose, intimating kindly that the interview was over. But it was by no means that yet, for there was still a good deal of entreaty and a great many tears on the one part, and reiterated kind assurances on the other. However, when, some 10 minutes later, the dainty clouds of lace and chiffon were finally wafted out of our office, we both felt that the poor, harmless, unutterably foolish little lady looked distinctly consoled and more happy than she had been for the past 12 months. A Day's Folly, Part 4. "Yes, she has been an utter little goose," Lady Molly was saying to me an hour later when we were having luncheon. "But that Jane Turner is a remarkably clever girl. I suppose you think, as I do, that the mysterious elderly female who seems to have impersonated the mother all through was an accomplice of Jane Turner's, and that the assault was a put-up job between them," I said. "Inspector Danvers will be delighted, for this theory is a near approach to his own." Was all the comment vouchsafed on my remark. "I am sure it was Arthur Cutbush, the girl's sweetheart, after all," I retorted hotly. "And you'll see that, put to the test of sworn evidence, his alibi at the time of the assault itself won't hold good. Moreover, now," I added triumphantly, "we have knowledge which has been lacking all along, the motive." "Ah," said my lady, smiling at my enthusiasm, "that's how you argue Mary, is it?" "Yes, and in my opinion the only question in doubt is whether Arthur Cutbush acted in collusion with Jane Turner or against her." "Well, suppose we go and elucidate that point, and some others, at once," concluded Lady Molly, as she rose from the table. She decided to return to Bristol that same evening. We were going by the 8:50 p.m., and I was just getting ready, the cab being already at the door, when I was somewhat startled by the sudden appearance into my room of an old lady, very beautifully dressed, with snow-white hair dressed high above a severe, interesting face. A merry, rippling laugh issuing from the wrinkled mouth, and a closer scrutiny on my part, soon revealed the identity of my dear lady, dressed up to look like an extremely dignified grande dame of the old school, whilst a pair of long, old-fashioned earrings gave a curious, foreign look to her whole appearance. I didn't quite see why she chose to arrive at the Grand Hotel Bristol in that particular disguise, nor why she entered our names in the hotel book as Grand Duchess and Princess Amalie von Starkburg from Germany, nor did she tell me anything that evening. But by the next afternoon, when we drove out together in a fly, I was well up in the rôle which I had to play. My lady had made me dress in a very rich black silk dress of her own, and ordered me to do my hair in a somewhat frumpish fashion, with a parting and a bun at the back. She herself looked more like royalty travelling incognito than ever, and no wonder small children and tradesmen's boys stared open-mouthed when we alighted from our fly outside one of the mean-looking little houses in Bread Street. In answer to our ring, a smutty little servant opened the door, and my lady asked her if Miss Jane Turner lived here, and if she were in. "Yes, Miss Turner lives here, and it being Thursday and early closing, she's home from business." "Then please tell her," said Lady Molly in her grandest manner, "that the Dowager Grand Duchess of Starkburg-Nauheim and the Princess Amalie desire to see her." The poor little maid nearly fell backwards with astonishment. She gasped an agitated "Lor!" and then flew down the narrow passage and up the steep staircase, closely followed by my dear lady and myself. On the first-floor landing, the girl, with nervous haste, knocked at a door, opened it, and muttered half-audibly, "Ladies to see you, miss." Then she fled incontinently upstairs. I have never been able to decide whether that little girl thought that we were lunatics, ghosts, or criminals. But already Lady Molly had sailed into the room, where Miss Jane Turner apparently had been sitting reading a novel. She jumped up when we entered and stared open-eyed at the gorgeous apparitions. She was not a bad-looking girl but for the provoking, bold look in her black eyes, and the general slatternly appearance of her person. "Pray do not disturb yourself, Miss Turner," said Lady Molly in broken English, as she sank into a chair and beckoned me to do likewise. "Pray sit down. I will be brief. You have a compromising photograph, is it not, of my daughter-in-law, the Countess of Hohengebirg? I am the Grand Duchess of Starkburg-Narheim. This is my daughter, the Princess Amelie. We are here incognito. You understand? Not?" And with inimitable elegance of gesture, my dear lady raised a pair of starers to her eyes and fixed them on Jane Turner's quaking figure. Never had I seen suspicion, nay terror, depicted so plainly on a young face, but I will do the girl the justice to state that she pulled herself together with marvellous strength of will. She fought down her awed respect of this great lady, or rather shall I say that the British middle-class want of respect for social superiority, especially if it be foreign, now stood her in good stead? "I don't know what you're talking about," she said with an arrogant toss of the head. "That is a lie, is it not?" rejoined Lady Molly calmly, as she drew from her reticule the typewritten letter which Jane Turner had sent to the Countess of Hohengebirg. "This you wrote to my daughter-in-law. The letter reached me instead of her. It interests me much. I will give you £2,000 for the photograph of her and Mr. Rumbold. You will sell it to me for that, is it not?" The production of the letter had somewhat cowed Jane's bold spirit, but she was still defiant. "I haven't got the photograph here," she said. "Ah, no, but you will get it, yes?" said my lady, quietly replacing the letter in her reticule. "In the letter you offer to get it for £1,000. I will give you 2,000. Today is a holiday for you. You will get the photograph from the gentleman, not? And I will wait here till you come back." Whereupon she arranged her skirts round her and folded her hands placidly, like one prepared to wait. "I haven't got the photograph," said Jane Turner doggedly, "and I can't get it today. The person who has it doesn't live in Bristol." "No? Ah, but quite close, isn't it?" rejoined my lady placidly. "I can wait all the day." "No, you shan't," returned Jane Turner, whose voice now shook with obvious rage or fear, I knew not which. "I can't get the photograph today, so there. And I won't sell it to you. I won't. I don't want your £2,000. How do I know you're not an impostor?" "From this, my good girl," said Lady Molly quietly, "that if I leave this room without the photograph, I go straight to the police with this letter, and you shall be prosecuted by the Grand Duke, my son, for blackmailing his wife. You see, I am not like my daughter-in-law. I am not afraid of a scandal, so you will fetch the photograph, isn't it? I and the Princess Amelie will wait for it here. That is your bedroom, not?" she added, pointing to a door which obviously gave on an inner room. "Will you put on your hat and go at once, please? £2,000 or 2 years in prison. You have the choice, isn't it?" Jane Turner tried to keep up her air of defiance, looking Lady Molly full in the face, but I who watched her could see the boldness in her eyes gradually giving place to fear, and then to terror, and even despair. The girl's face seemed literally to grow old as I looked at it, pale, haggard, and drawn, whilst Lady Molly kept her stern, luminous eyes fixed steadily upon her. Then, with a curious, wild gesture, which somehow filled me with a nameless fear, Jane Turner turned on her heel and ran into the inner room. There followed a moment of silence. To me it was tense and agonizing. I was straining my ears to hear what was going on in that inner room. That my dear lady was not as callous as she wished to appear was shown by the strange look of expectancy in her beautiful eyes. The minutes sped on. How many I could not afterwards have said. I was conscious of a clock ticking monotonously over the shabby mantelpiece, of an errand-boy outside shouting at the top of his voice, of the measured step of the cab-horse, which had brought us hither, being walked up and down the street. Then suddenly there was a violent crash, as of heavy furniture being thrown down. I could not suppress a scream, for my nerves by now were terribly on the jar. "Quick, Mary, the inner room," said Lady Molly. "I thought the girl might do that." I dared not pause in order to ask what that meant, but flew to the door. It was locked. "Downstairs, quick," commanded my lady. "I ordered Danvers to be on the watch outside." You may imagine how I flew, and how I blessed my dear lady's forethought in the midst of her daring plan, when, having literally torn open the front door, I saw Inspector Danvers in plain clothes, calmly patrolling the street. I beckoned to him. He was keeping a sharp lookout, and together we ran back into the house. Fortunately, the landlady and the servant were busy in the basement, and had neither heard the crash nor seen me run in search of Danvers. My dear lady was still alone in the dingy parlour, stooping against the door of the inner room, her ear glued to the keyhole. "Not too late, I think," she whispered hurriedly. "Break it open, Danvers." Danvers, who is a great, strong man, soon put his shoulder to the rickety door, which yielded to the first blow. The sight which greeted us filled me with horror, for I had never seen such a tragedy before. The wretched girl, Jane Turner, had tied a rope to a ring in the ceiling, which I suppose at one time held a hanging lamp. The other end of that rope she had formed into a slip noose and passed round her neck. She had apparently climbed onto a table, and then used her best efforts to end her life by kicking the table away from under her. This was the crash which we had heard, and which had caused us to come to her rescue. Fortunately, her feet had caught in the back of a chair close by. The slip noose was strangling her, and her face was awful to behold, but she was not dead. Danvers soon got her down. He is a first-aid man, and has done these terrible jobs before. As soon as the girl had partially recovered, Lady Molly sent him and me out of the room. In the dark and dusty parlour, where but a few moments ago I had played my small part in a grim comedy, I now waited to hear what the sequel to it would be. Danvers had been gone some time, and the shades of evening were drawing in. Outside, the mean-looking street looked particularly dreary. It was close on 6 o'clock when at last I heard the welcome rustle of silks, the opening of a door, and at last my dear lady, looking grave but serene, came out of the inner room, and beckoning to me, without a word, led the way out of the house and into the fly, which was still waiting at the door. "We'll send the doctor to her," were her first words as soon as we were clear of Bread Street, "but she is quite all right now, save that she wants a sleeping draught. Well, she has been punished enough, I think. She won't try her hand at blackmailing again." "Then the photograph never existed?" I asked, amazed. "No, the plate was a failure, but Jane Turner would not thus readily give up the idea of getting money out of the poor, pusillanimous Countess. We know how she succeeded in terrorizing that silly little woman. It is wonderful how cleverly a girl like that worked out such a complicated scheme all alone." "All alone?" "Yes, there was no one else. She was the elderly woman who used to meet the Countess, and who rang at the front door of the Weston apartment house. She arranged the whole of the mise en scène of the assault on herself all alone, and took everybody in with it, it was so perfectly done. She planned and executed it because she was afraid that the little Countess would be goaded into confessing her folly to her husband, or to her parents, when a prosecution for blackmail would inevitably follow. So she risked everything on a big coup, and almost succeeded in getting £1,000 from Her Serene Highness, meaning to reassure her, as soon as she had the money, by the statement that the negative and prints had been destroyed. But the appearance of the Grand Duchess of Starkburg-Nauheim this afternoon frightened her into an act of despair. Confronted with the prosecution she dreaded, and with the prison she dared not face, she, in a mad moment, attempted to take her life. I suppose now the whole matter will be hushed up." "Yes," replied Lady Molly with a wistful sigh, "the public will never know who assaulted Jane Turner." She was naturally a little regretful at that, but it was a joy to see her, the day when she was able to assure Her Serene Highness, the Countess of Hohengebirg, that she need never again fear the consequences of that fatal day's folly. End of A Day's Folly, Part 4. Chapter 6, Part 1 of Lady Molly of Scotland Yard, by Baroness Orczy. A Castle in Brittany, Part 1. Yes, we are just back from our holiday, my dear lady and I, a well-earned holiday, I can tell you that. We went to Porhoët, you know, a dear little village in the hinterland of Brittany, not very far from the coast, an enchanting spot, hidden away in a valley, bordered by a mountain stream, wild, romantic, picturesque Brittany, in fact. We had discovered the little place quite accidentally last year, in the course of our wanderings, and stayed there then about 3 weeks, laying the foundations of that strange adventure which reached its culminating point just a month ago. I don't know if the story will interest you, for Lady Molly's share in the adventure was purely a private one, and had nothing whatever to do with her professional work. At the same time, it illustrates in a very marked manner that extraordinary faculty which she possesses of divining her fellow creatures' motives and intentions. We had rooms and pension in the dear little convent on the outskirts of the village, close to the quaint church and the picturesque presbytery, and soon we made the acquaintance of the Curé, a simple-minded, kindly old man, whose sorrow at the thought that two such charming English ladies as Lady Molly and myself should be heretics was more than counterbalanced by his delight in having someone of the great outside world, as he called it, to talk to, whilst he told us quite ingeniously something of his own simple life, of this village which he loved, and also of his parishioners. One personality among the latter occupied his thoughts and conversation a great deal, and I must say interested us keenly. It was that of Miss Angela de Genneville, who owned the magnificent château of Porhoët, one of the 7 wonders of architectural France. She was an Englishwoman by birth, being of a Jersey family, and was immensely wealthy, her uncle, who was also her godfather, having bequeathed to her the largest cigar factory in St. Heliers, besides 750,000 sterling. To say that Miss de Genneville was eccentric was but to put it mildly. In the village she was generally thought to be quite mad. The Curé vaguely hinted that a tragic love story was at the bottom of all her eccentricities. Certain it is that, for no apparent reason, and when she was still a youngish woman, she had sold the Jersey business and realized the whole of her fortune. After 2 years of continuous travelling she came to Brittany on a visit to her sister, the widowed Marquise de Terhoven, who owned a small property close to Porhoët, and lived there in retirement and poverty with their only son Amédée. Miss Angela de Genneville was agreeably taken with the beauty and quietude of this remote little village. The beautiful château of Porhoët being for sale at the time, she bought it, took out letters of naturalization, became a French subject, and from that moment never went outside the precincts of her newly acquired domain. She never returned to England, and, with the exception of the Curé and her own sister and nephew, saw no one beyond her small retinue of servants. But the dear old Curé thought all the world of her, for she was supremely charitable to him and to the poor, and scarcely a day passed but he told us something either of her kindness or of her eccentric ways. One day he arrived at the convent at an unaccustomed hour. We had just finished our simple déjeuner of steaming coffee and rolls when we saw him coming towards us across the garden. That he was excited and perturbed was at once apparent by his hurried gait and by the flush on his kindly face. He bade us a very hasty "Good morning, my daughters," and plunged abruptly into his subject. He explained with great volubility, which was intended to mask his agitation, that he was the bearer of an invitation to the charming English lady, a curious invitation, ah yes, perhaps, Mademoiselle de Genneville, very eccentric, but she is in great trouble, in very serious trouble, and very ill too. Now, poor lady, half paralyzed and feeble, yes, feeble in the brain, and then her nephew, the Marquis Amédée de Terhoven, such a misguided young man, who has got into bad company in that den of wickedness called Paris. Since then it has been debts, always debts. His mother is so indulgent, too indulgent, but an only son. The charming English ladies would understand. It was very sad, very, very sad, and no wonder Mademoiselle de Genneville was very angry. She had paid Monsieur le Marquis' debts once, twice, 3 times, but now she will not pay any more. But she is in great trouble and wants a friend, a female friend, one of her own country, she declares, for he himself, alas, was only a poor curé du village, and did not understand great ladies and their curious ways. It would be true Christian charity if the charming English lady would come and see mademoiselle. But her own sister, the Marquise, suggested Lady Molly, breaking in on the old man's volubility. Ah, her sister, of course, he replied with a sigh. Madame la Marquise. But then she is Monsieur le Marquis' mother, and the charming English lady would understand. A mother's heart, of course. But I am a complete stranger to Miss de Genneville, protested Lady Molly. Ah, but mademoiselle has always remained an Englishwoman at heart, replied the Curé. She said to me today, I seem to long for an Englishwoman's handshake, a sober-minded, sensible Englishwoman, to help me in this difficulty. Bring your English friend to me, Monsieur le Curé, if she will come to the assistance of an old woman who has no one to turn to in her distress. Of course, after that I knew that my dear lady would yield. Moreover, she was keenly interested in Miss de Genneville, and without further discussion she told Monsieur le Curé that she was quite ready to accompany him to the Château of Porhoët. A Castle in Brittany, Part II. Of course, I was not present at the interview, but Lady Molly has so often told me all that happened and how it happened, and with such a wealth of picturesque and minute detail that sometimes I find it difficult to realize that I myself was not there in person. It seems that Monsieur le Curé himself ushered my lady into the presence of Miss Angela de Genneville. The old lady was not alone when they entered. Madame la Marquise de Terhoven, an elderly, somewhat florid woman, whose features, though distinctly coarse, recalled those of her sister, sat on a high-backed chair close to a table, on which her fingers were nervously drumming a tattoo, whilst in the window embrasure stood a young man, whose resemblance to both the ladies at once proclaimed him to Lady Molly's quick perception as the son of the one and the nephew of the other, the Marquis de Terhoven, in fact. Miss de Genneville sat erect in a huge armchair. Her face was the hue of yellow wax, the flesh literally shriveled on the bones, the eyes of a curious, unnatural brilliance. One hand clutched feverishly the arm of her chair, the other, totally paralyzed, lay limp and inert in her lap. "Ah, the Englishwoman at last, thank God!" she said in a high-pitched, strident voice as soon as Lady Molly entered the room. "Come here, my dear, for I have wanted one of your kind badly. A true-hearted Englishwoman is the finest product of God's earth, after all said and done. Pardieu, but I breathe again," she added, as my dear lady advanced somewhat diffidently to greet her, and took the trembling hand which Miss Angela extended to her. "Sit down close to me," commanded the eccentric old lady, whilst Lady Molly, confused, and not a little angered at finding herself in the very midst of what was obviously a family conclave, was vaguely wondering how soon she could slip away again. But the trembling hand of the paralytic clutched her own slender wrist so tightly, forcing her to sink into a low chair close by, and holding her there as with a grip of steel, that it would have been useless and perhaps cruel to resist. Satisfied now that her newly found friend, as well as Monsieur le Curé, were prepared to remain by her and to listen to what she had to say, the sick woman turned with a look of violent wrath towards the window embrasure. "I was just telling that fine nephew of mine that he is counting his chickens before they are hatched. I am not yet dead, as monsieur my nephew can see, and I have made a will, and placed it where his thievish fingers can never reach it." The young man, who up to now had been gazing stolidly out of the window, now suddenly turned on his heel, confronting the old woman, with a look of hate gleaming in his eyes. "We can fight the will," here interposed Madame la Marquise icily. "On what grounds?" queried the other. "That you were paralyzed and imbecile when you made it," replied the Marquise dryly. Monsieur le Curé, who up to now had been fidgeting nervously with his hat, now raised his hands and eyes to the ceiling to emphasize the horror which he felt at this callous suggestion. Lady Molly no longer desired to go. The half-paralyzed grip on her wrist had relaxed, but she sat there quietly, interested with every fibre of her quick intelligence in the moving drama which was being unfolded before her. There was a pause now, a silence broken only by the monotonous ticking of a monumental, curious-looking clock which stood in the angle of the room. Miss de Genneville made no reply to her sister's cruel taunt, but a look, furtive, maniacal, almost dangerous, now crept into her eyes. Then she addressed the Curé. "I pray you, pen, ink, and paper, here on this table," she requested. Then, as he complied with alacrity, she once more turned to her nephew, and pointing to the writing materials, "Sit down and write, Amédée," she commanded. "Write what?" he queried. "A confession, my nephew," said the old woman with a shrill laugh. "A confession of those little peccadilloes of yours, which, unless I come to your rescue now, will land you for 7 years in a penal settlement, if I mistake not, my fine nephew?" "A confession!" retorted Amédée de Terhoven savagely. "Do you take me for a fool?" "No, my nephew, I take you for a wise man, who understands that his dear aunt will not buy those interesting forgeries perpetrated by Monsieur le Marquis Amédée de Terhoven, and offered to her by Rubinstein the moneylender, unless that confession is written and signed by you. Write, Amédée, write that confession, my dear nephew, if you do not wish to see yourself in the dock on a charge of forging your aunt's name to a bill of 100,000 francs." Amédée muttered a curse between his teeth. Obviously the old woman's shaft had struck home. He knew himself to be in a hopeless plight. It appears that a money-lender had threatened to send the forged bills to Monsieur le Procureur de la République unless they were paid within 24 hours, and no one could pay them but Miss de Genneville, who had refused to do it except at the price of this humiliating confession. A look of intelligence passed between mother and son. Intercepted by Lady Molly, and interpreted by her, it seemed to suggest the idea of humouring the old aunt, for the moment, until the forgeries were safely out of the money-lender's hands, then of mollifying her later on, when perhaps she would have forgotten, or sunk deeper into helplessness and imbecility. As if in answer to his mother's look, the young man now said curtly, "I must know what use you mean to make of the confession if I do write it." "That will depend on yourself," replied Mademoiselle dryly. "You may be sure that I will not willingly send my own nephew to penal servitude." For another moment the young man hesitated. Then he sat down, sullen and wrathful, and said, "I'll write. You may dictate." The old woman laughed a short, dry, sarcastic laugh. Then, at her dictation, Amédé wrote, "I, Amédé, Marquis de Terhoven, hereby make confession to having forged Mademoiselle Angela de Genneville's name to the annexed bills, thereby obtaining the sum of 100,000 francs from Abraham Rubinstein of Brest." "Now, Monsieur le Curé, would you kindly witness le Marquis's signature?" said the irascible old lady, when Amédé had finished writing. "And you too, my dear?" she added, turning to Lady Molly. My lady hesitated for a moment. Naturally, she did not desire to be thus mixed up in this family feud, but a strange impulse had drawn her sympathy to this eccentric old lady, who, in the midst of her semi-regal splendour, seemed so forlorn, between her nephew, who was a criminal and a blackguard, and her sister, who was but little less contemptible. Obeying this impulse, and also a look of entreaty from the Curé, she affixed her own signature as witness to the document, and this despite the fact that both the Marquise and her son threw her a look of hate which might have made a weaker spirit tremble with foreboding. Not so Lady Molly. Those very same threatening looks served but to decide her. Then, at Mademoiselle's command, she folded up the document, slipped it into an envelope, sealed it, and finally addressed it to Monsieur le Procureur de la République, resident at Caen. Amédé watched all these proceedings with eyes that were burning with impotent wrath. "This letter," now resumed the old lady more calmly, "will be sent under cover to my lawyer, Maître Vendôme of Paris, who drew up my will, with orders only to post it in case of certain eventualities, which I will explain later on. In the meanwhile, my dear nephew, you may apprise your friend Abraham Rubinstein that I will buy back those interesting forgeries of yours on the day on which I hear from Maître Vendôme that he has safely received my letter with this enclosure." "This is infamous!" here broke in the Marquise, rising in full wrath, unable to control herself any longer. "I'll have you put under restraint as a dangerous lunatic. Then, of course, I could not buy back the bills from Rubinstein," rejoined Mademoiselle calmly. Then, as the Marquise subsided, cowed, terrified, realizing the hopelessness of her son's position, the old lady turned placidly to my dear lady, whilst her trembling fingers once more clutched the slender hand of her newly found English friend. "I have asked you, my dear, and Monsieur le Curé, to come to me to-day," she said, "because I wish you both to be of assistance to me in carrying out my dying wishes. You must promise me most solemnly, both of you, that when I am dead you will carry out these wishes to the letter. Promise!" she added, with passionate earnestness. The promise was duly given by Lady Molly and the old Curé. Then Mademoiselle resumed more calmly. "And now I want you to look at that clock," she said abruptly, with seeming irrelevance. "It is an old heirloom which belonged to the former owners of Porhoët, and which I bought along with the house. You will notice that it is one of the most remarkable pieces of mechanism which brain of man has ever devised, for it has this great peculiarity, that it goes for 366 days consecutively, keeping most perfect time. When the works have all but run down, the weights, which are enormous, release a certain spring, and the great doors of the case open of themselves, thus allowing the clock to be wound up. After that is done, and the doors pushed to again, no one can open them until another 366 days have gone by, that is to say, not without breaking the case to pieces." Lady Molly examined the curious old clock with great attention. Vaguely she guessed already what the drift of the old lady's curious explanations would be. "2 days ago," continued Mademoiselle, "the clock was open, and Monsieur le Curé wound it up. But before I pushed the doors to again, I slipped certain papers into the case. You remember, monsieur?"
"Yes, mademoiselle, I remember," responded the old man.
"Those papers were my last will and testament, bequeathing all I possessed to the parish of Porhoët," said Miss de Genneville dryly. "And now the doors of the massive case are closed. No one can get at my will for another 364 days. No one," she added with a shrill laugh, "not even my nephew, Amédé de Terhoven." A silence ensued, only broken by the rustle of Madame la Marquise's silk dress as she shrugged her shoulders and gave a short, sarcastic chuckle. "My dear," resumed Mademoiselle, looking straight into Lady Molly's eager, glowing face, "you must promise me that, 364 days hence, that is to say, on the 20th September next year, you and Monsieur le Curé, or one of you if the other be incapacitated, will be present in this room at this hour when the door of the clock will open. You will then wind up the family heirloom, take out the papers which you will find buried beneath the weights, and hand them over to Maître Vendôme for probate at the earliest opportunity. Monseigneur, the Bishop of Caen, the mayor of this commune, and the sous-préfet of this department have all been informed of the contents of my will, and also that it is practically in the keeping of the Curé de Porhoët, who, no doubt, realizes what the serious consequences to himself would be if he failed to produce the will at the necessary time." The poor Curé gasped in terror. But, he stammered meekly, I may be forcibly prevented from entering the house. I might be ill, or—" He shuddered with an unavowable fear, then added more calmly, "I might be unjustly accused then of stealing the will, of defrauding the poor of Porhoët in favour of mademoiselle's direct heirs." "Have no fear, my good friend," said mademoiselle dryly. "Though I have one foot in the grave, I am not quite so imbecile as my dear sister and nephew here would suggest, and I have provided for every eventuality. If you are ill, or otherwise prevented by outside causes from being present here on the day and hour named, this charming English lady will be able to replace you. But if either of you is forcibly prevented from entering this house, or if having entered this room the slightest violence or even pressure is put upon you, or if you should find the clock broken, damaged, and stripped of its contents, all you need to do is apprise Maître Vendôme of the fact. He will know how to act." "What would he do?" "Send a certain confession we all know of to Monsieur le Procureur de la République," replied the old lady, fixing the young Marquis Amédé with her irascible eye. "That same confession," she continued lightly, "Maître Vendôme is instructed to destroy, if you, monsieur, and my English friend here, and the clock, are all undamaged on the eventful day." There was silence in the great dark room for a while, broken only by the sarcastic chuckle of the enfeebled invalid, tired out after this harrowing scene, wherein she had pitted her half-maniacal ingenuity against the greed and rapacity of a conscienceless roué. That she had hemmed her nephew and sister in on every side could not be denied. Lady Molly herself felt somewhat awed at this weird revenge conceived by the outraged old lady against her grasping relatives. She was far too interested in the whole drama to give up her own part in it, and as she subsequently explained to me, she felt it her duty to remain the partner and co-worker of the poor Curé in this dangerous task of securing to the poor of Porhoët the fortune which otherwise would be squandered away on gaming tables and racecourses. For this, and many reasons too complicated to analyze, she decided to accept her share in the trust imposed upon her by her newly found friend. Neither the Marquise nor her son took any notice of Lady Molly as she presently took leave of Mademoiselle de Genneville, who at the last made her take a solemn oath that she would stand by the Curé and fulfil the wishes of a dying and much wronged woman. Much perturbed, Monsieur le Curé went away. Lady Molly went several times after that to the château of Porhoët to see the invalid, who had taken a violent fancy to her. In October we had, perforce, to return to England and to work, and the following spring we had news from the Curé that Mademoiselle de Genneville was dead. A Castle in Brittany, Part 3. Lady Molly had certainly been working too hard, and was in a feeble state of health when we reached Porhoët the following 19th of September, less than 24 hours before the eventful moment when the old clock would reveal the will and testament of Mademoiselle de Genneville. We walked straight from the station to the presbytery, anxious to see the Curé and to make all arrangements for tomorrow's business. To our terrible sorrow and distress, we were informed by the housekeeper that the Curé was very seriously ill at the hospital at Brest, whither he had been removed by the doctor's orders. This was the first inkling I had that things would not go as smoothly as I had anticipated. Miss de Genneville's dispositions with regard to the sensational disclosure of her will had, to my mind, been so ably taken that it had never struck me until now that the Marquise de Terhoven and her precious son would make a desperate fight before they gave up all thoughts of the coveted fortune. I imagined the Marquis hemmed in on every side, any violence offered against the Curé or Lady Molly when they entered the château in order to accomplish the task allotted to them being visited by the sending of the confession to Monsieur the Procureur de la République, when prosecution for forgery would immediately follow. Damage to the clock itself would be punished in the same way. But I had never thought of sudden illness, of heaven help us, poison or unaccountable accidents to either the Curé or to the woman I loved best in all the world. No wonder Lady Molly looked pale and fragile as, having thanked the housekeeper, we found our way in silence to the convent where we had once again engaged rooms. Somehow the hospitality shown us last year had lost something of its cordiality. Moreover, our bedrooms this time did not communicate with one another, but opened out independently onto a stone passage. The sister who showed us upstairs explained, somewhat shamefacedly, that as the Mother Superior had not expected us, she had let the room which was between our two bedrooms to a lady visitor who, however, was ill in bed at the present moment. That sixth sense, of which so much has been said and written, but which I will not attempt to explain, told me plainly enough that we were no longer amidst friends in the convent. Had bribery been at work? Was the lady visitor a spy set upon our movements by the Terhovens? It was impossible to say. I could no longer chase away the many gloomy forebodings which assailed me the rest of that day and drove away sleep during the night. I can assure you that in my heart I wished all eccentric old ladies and their hidden wills at the bottom of the sea. My dear lady was apparently also very deeply perturbed. Any attempt on my part to broach the subject of Miss de Genneville's will was promptly and authoritatively checked by her. At the same time I knew her well enough to guess that all these nameless dangers which seemed to have crept up round her only served to enhance her determination to carry out her old friend's dying wishes to the letter. We went to bed quite early, for the first time without that delightful final gossip, when events, plans, surmises, and work were freely discussed between us. The unseen lady visitor in the room which separated us acted as a wet blanket on our intimacy. I stayed with Lady Molly until she was in bed. She hardly talked to me whilst she undressed, but when I kissed her good night she whispered almost inaudibly right into my ear, "The Terhoven factor are at work. They may waylay you and offer you a bribe to keep me out of the château tomorrow. Pretend to fall in with their views. Accept all bribes and place yourself at their disposal. I must not say more now. We are being spied upon." That my lady was, as usual, right in her surmises was proved within the next 5 minutes. I had slipped out of her room and was just going into mine when I heard my name spoken hardly above a whisper, whilst I felt my arm gently squeezed from behind. An elderly, somewhat florid woman stood before me attired in a dingy-coloured dressing-gown. She was pointing towards my own bedroom door, implying her desire to accompany me to my room. Remembering my dear lady's parting injunctions, I nodded in acquiescence. She followed me, after having peered cautiously up and down the passage. Then, when the door was duly closed, and she was satisfied that we were alone, she said very abruptly, "Miss Granard, tell me, you are poor, eh? A paid companion to your rich friend, what?" Still thinking of Lady Molly's commands, I replied with a pathetic sigh. "Then," said the old lady eagerly, "would you like to earn 50,000 francs?" The eagerness with which I responded "Rather!" apparently pleased her, for she gave a sigh of satisfaction. "You know the story of my sister's will, of the clock?" she asked eagerly. "Of your friend's role in this shameless business?" Once more I nodded. I knew that my lady had guessed rightly. This was the Marquise de Terhoven, planted here in the convent to gain my confidence, to spy on Lady Molly, and to offer me a bribe. Now for some clever tactics on my part. "Can you prevent your friend from being at the château tomorrow, before 1 o'clock?" asked the Marquise. "Easily," I replied calmly. "How?" "She is ill, as you know. The doctor has ordered her a sleeping draught. I administer it. I can arrange that she has a strong dose in the morning instead of her other medicine. She will sleep till the late afternoon." I rattled this off glibly in my best French. Madame la Marquise heaved a deep sigh of relief. "Ah, that is good," she said. "Then listen to me. Do as I tell you, and tomorrow you will be richer by 50,000 francs. Come to the château in the morning, dressed in your friend's clothes. My son will be there. Together you will assist in the opening of the secret doors, and when my son has wound up the old clock himself, he will place 50,000 francs in your hands." "But Monsieur le Curé?" I suggested tentatively. "He is ill," she replied curtly. But as she spoke these 3 words, there was such an evil sneer in her face, such a look of cruel triumph in her eyes, that all my worst suspicions were at once confirmed. Had these people's unscrupulous rapacity indeed bribed some needy country practitioner to put the Curé temporarily out of the way? It was too awful to think of. And I can tell you that I needed all my presence of mind, all my desire to act my part bravely and intelligently to the end, not to fly from this woman in horror. She gave me a few more instructions with regard to the services which she and her precious son would expect of me on the morrow. It seems that, some time before her death, Miss de Genneville had laid strict injunctions on 2 of her most trusted men-servants to remain in the château and to be on the watch on the eventful 20th day of September of this year, lest any serious violence be done to the English lady or to the Curé. It was with a view to allay any suspicion which might arise in the minds of these 2 men that the Marquis desired me to impersonate Lady Molly tomorrow, and to enter with him, on seemingly friendly terms, the room where stood the monumental clock. For these services, together with those whereby Lady Molly was to be sent into a drugged sleep whilst the theft of the will was being carried through, I, Mary Granard, was to receive from Monsieur le Marquis de Terhoven the sum of 50,000 francs. All these matters being settled to this wicked woman's apparent satisfaction, she presently took hold of both my hands, shook them warmly, and called me her dearest friend, assured me of everlasting gratitude, and finally, to my intense relief, slipped noiselessly out of my room. A Castle in Brittany, Part 4. I surmised, I think correctly, that Madame la Marquise would spend most of the night with her ear glued to the thin partition which separated her room from that of Lady Molly. So I did not dare to go and report myself and the monumentous conversation which I had just had, and vaguely wondered when I should have an opportunity of talking matters over with my dear lady without feeling that a spy was at my heels. The next morning when I went into her room, to my boundless amazement, and before I had time to utter a word, she moaned audibly, as if in great pain, and said feebly but very distinctly, "Oh, Mary, I'm so glad you've come. I feel terribly ill. I haven't had a wink of sleep all night, and I am too weak to attempt to get up." Fortunately, my perceptions had not been dulled by the excitement of the past few hours, and I could see that she was not so ill as she made out. Her eyes sought mine, and as I approached her bed, and her lips alone framed the words which I believe I interpreted correctly, "Do as they want. I stay in bed. Will explain later." Evidently she had reason to think that we were being closely watched, but what I could not understand was, what did she expect would happen if she herself were not present when the opening of the clock door would disclose the will? Did she want me to snatch the document, to bear the brunt of the Terhovens' wrath and disappointment? It was not like her to be afraid of fulfilling a duty, however dangerous that fulfilment might prove, and it certainly was not like her to break a promise given to a dying person. But of course my business was to obey. Assuming that our movements were being watched, I poured out a dose of medicine for my dear lady, which she took and then fell back on her pillows as if exhausted. "I think I could sleep now, Mary," she said, "but wake me later on. I must be at the château by 12 o'clock, you know." As one of Lady Molly's boxes was in my room, I had no difficulty in arraying myself in some of her clothes. Thus equipped and closely veiled, still ignorant of my lady's plans, anxious but determined to obey like a soldier, blindly and unquestioningly, I made my way to the château a little before noon. An old butler opened the door in answer to my ring, and in the inner hall sat the Marquise de Terhoven, whilst her son was walking agitatedly up and down. "Ah, here comes my lady," said the Marquise with easy unconcern. "You have come, my lady," she added, rising and taking my hand, "to perform a duty which will rob my son of a fortune which by right should have been his. We can put no hindrance in your way, under penalty of an appalling disgrace which would then fall on my son. Moreover, my late sister has filled this house with guards and spies, so believe me, you need have no fear. You can perform your duty undisturbed. Perhaps you will not object to my son keeping you company? My precious sister had the door of her room removed before her death, and a curtain put in its stead." She concluded with what was intended to be a sneer of a disappointed fortune-hunter. "So the least call from you will bring her spies to your assistance." Without a word, the Marquis and I bowed to one another. Then, preceded by the old family butler, we went up the monumental staircase to what I suppose had been the eccentric old lady's room. The butler drew the portière curtain aside, and he remained in the corridor whilst we went within. There stood the massive clock exactly as my lady had often described it to me. It was ticking with slow and deep-toned majesty. Monsieur le Marquis pointed to an armchair for me. He was obviously in a state of terrible nerve tension. He could not sit still, and his fingers were incessantly clasped and unclasped with a curious febrile movement, which betrayed his intense agitation. I was about to make a remark when he abruptly seized my wrist, placed one finger to his lips, and pointed in the direction of the portière. Apparently he thought that someone was on the watch outside, but the clock itself was so placed that it could not be seen by anyone who was not actually in the room. After that we were both silent, whilst the old piece of mechanism ticked on relentlessly, still hiding the secret which it contained. I would have given 2 years' salary to know what Lady Molly would have wished me to do. Frankly, I fully expected to see her walk in at any moment. I could not bring myself to believe that she meant to shirk her duty. But she had said to me, "Fall in with their views," so that when, presently, the Marquis beckoned to me across the room to come and examine the clock, I obeyed readily enough. I felt by that time as if my entire body was stuffed with needles and pins, which were pricking my nerves and skin until I could have yelled with the agony of the sensation. I walked across the room as if in a dream, and looked at the curious clock which, in less than 15 minutes, would reveal its hidden secret. I suppose cleverer people than poor Mary Granard could enter into long philosophical disquisitions as to this dumb piece of mechanism which held the fate of this ruined, unscrupulous gambler safely within its doors. But I was only conscious of that incessant tick, 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 whilst my eyes literally ached with staring at the door. I don't know now how it all happened, for, of course, I was taken unawares. But the next moment I found myself quite helpless, hardly able to breathe, for a woolen scarf was being wound round my mouth, whilst 2 strong arms encircled my body so that I could not move. "This is only a protection for myself, my dear Miss Granard," a trembling voice whispered in my ear. "Keep quite still. No harm will come to you. In 10 minutes you shall have your 50,000 francs in your pocket, and can walk unconcernedly out of the château. Neither your English lady nor Monsieur le Curé can say that they suffered any violence, nor will the clock be damaged. What happens after that I care not. The law cannot wrest the old fool's fortune from me once I have destroyed her accursed will." To begin to tell you what passed in my mind then were an impossibility. Did I actually guess what would happen, and what my dear lady had planned? Or was it merely the engrafted sympathy which exists between her and me which caused me to act blindly in accordance with her wishes? "Fall in with their views, take their bribes," she had said, and I, like a soldier, obeyed this command to the letter. I remained absolutely still, scarcely moving an eyelid as I watched the face of the clock, the minutes speeding on, now 3, now 5, now 10. I could hear the Marquis's stertorous breathing close beside me. Was I dreaming, or did I really see now a dark line, the width of a hair, between the massive double doors of the clock case? Oh, how my pulses throbbed! The dark line was widening perceptibly. The doors were slowly opening. For the moment I almost felt in sympathy with the blackguard who was on the watch with me. His agitation must have been the most exquisite torture. Now we could distinctly see the glimmer of white paper, not pressed down by the ponderous weights, but lying loosely just inside the doors, and anon, as the aperture widened, the papers fell out just at my feet. With a smothered, gurgling exclamation which I will not attempt to describe, the Marquis literally fell on that paper, like a hungry beast upon its prey. He was on his knees before me, and I could see that the paper was a square envelope which, with a trembling hand, he tore open. It contained a short document whereon the signature Amédée de Terhoven was clearly visible. It was the confession of forgery made by the young Marquis just a year ago. There were also a few banknotes, some 100,000 francs, perhaps. The young man threw them furiously aside, and once more turned to the clock. The doors were wide open, but they revealed nothing save the huge and complicated mechanism of the clock. Mademoiselle de Genneville, eccentric and far-seeing to the last, had played this gigantic hoax on her scheming relatives. Whilst they directed all their unscrupulous energies towards trying to obtain possession of her will in one place, she had calmly put it securely somewhere else. Meanwhile, Monsieur le Marquis had sufficient presence of mind, and, I must own, sufficient dignity, not only to release me from my bonds, but also to offer me the 50,000 francs which he had promised me. "I can wind up the clock now," he said dully, "and you can walk straight out of this place. No one need know that you impersonated your friend. She, no doubt, knew of this hoax. Therefore we found the scheme to keep her out of the way so easy of accomplishment. It was a grisly joke, wasn't it? How the old witch must be chortling in her grave." Needless to say, I did not take his money. He escorted me downstairs silently, subdued, no doubt, by the spirit of hatred which had followed him up from the land of shadows. He even showed no surprise when, on reaching the hall, he was met by his late aunt's lawyer, Maître Vendôme, and also by Lady Molly, who had just arrived. Madame la Marquise de Terhoven was nowhere to be seen. My dear lady smiled at me approvingly, and when I came near she contrived to draw me aside and to whisper hurriedly, "You have done admirably, Mary. I came to fetch you. But now that this young blackguard is thoroughly outwitted, we may as well go, for our work here is done." The Marquis did not even glance at her as she slightly bowed her head to him, took leave of Maître Vendôme, and finally walked out of the château with me. As soon as we were out in the open air, I begged for an explanation. "Maître Vendôme has mademoiselle's will," she replied. "She had enjoined him to read it in the château, to-day in the presence of 3 trustees appointed for the poor of Porhoët, who inherit all her wealth." "And the Terhovens?" I asked. "They've got his confession back," she said dryly, "and they will receive an annuity from the trustees." "And you knew this all along," I rejoined somewhat reproachfully. "Yes, so did the Curé, but mademoiselle made me swear a most solemn oath not to reveal her secret, even to you. She was so afraid of the machinations of the Terhovens. You see," continued Lady Molly, smiling at my eagerness, "Miss de Genneville possessed the ancient key wherewith she could open the clock case at any time. Obviously, even so perfect a piece of mechanism might go wrong, when examination and readjustment of the works would be necessary. After the family conclave wherein she had announced that her will was hidden in the clock, I, at my next interview with her, begged her to modify this idea, to send her will to her solicitor, but to leave the Terhovens under the impression that it was still lying in its strange hiding-place. At first she refused to listen to me or to discuss the subject, but I am happy to say that I finally succeeded in persuading her, with what result you already know." "But poor Monsieur the Curé!" I ejaculated. Her bright eyes gleamed with merriment. "Oh, that was the final little hoax. He himself, poor dear, was afraid lest he might blurt out the whole thing. His illness was partly a sham, and he is quite all right again now, but the doctor at the Brest Hospital is a great friend of his, and is keeping him there until all this business has blown over." "I was the only one who was kept in the dark," I concluded ruefully. "Yes, Mary dear," said my dear lady gently. "It was a promise, remember. But I never thought that we should get so much excitement outside our own professional work." It certainly had been a non-professional experience, but here too, as in the detection of crime, her keen intuition had proved more than a match for an unscrupulous blackguard. And certainly on the 20th day of September last, I lived through the most exciting 10 minutes of my life.